Hey guys, tonight we're descending into one of history's most disgusting and deadly environments, the sewers beneath medieval European cities. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a narrow stone opening in a cramped alley somewhere in 14th century London. The smell hits you first, a wave of rotting organic matter so thick you can taste it on your tongue. Below, you hear water trickling, except it's not water, not really. It's a slow-moving river of human waste, animal carcasses, chemical runoff from nearby tanneries, and refuse that's been accumulating since your great-grandfather was born. You're about to climb down there. You're about to spend an entire day navigating this underground nightmare. And honestly, you probably won't make it to sunset. Medieval city sewers weren't the engineered marvels of ancient Rome or the systematic networks we have today. They were afterthoughts, cobbled together from whatever materials were cheap and available, maintained by the desperate and the damned, and filled with dangers that would make a modern health inspector weep. This wasn't infrastructure. This was organized chaos with a thin veneer of stone covering it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community of history nerds and insomniacs come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lowering yourself into the darkness now, your feet searching for purchase on slime-covered stones. The opening above, your last glimpse of daylight, shrinks to a distant circle as you descend. Your hands press against walls that feel disturbingly organic, slick with substances you desperately don't want to identify. Already, your modern sensibilities are screaming at you to climb back up, to abandon this foolish experiment. But you're committed now. Welcome to a world where the concept of sanitation is barely a whisper in the minds of natural philosophers, where your waste goes down and supposedly away, and nobody with any sense asks where away actually is. The medieval city above you is a densely packed warren of timber-framed buildings, sometimes 7 or 8 stories tall, leaning so close together across narrow streets that neighbors can shake hands from opposite windows. Tens of thousands of people are crammed into spaces that would comfortably hold a fraction of that population today. Every single one of them produces waste, human excrement, urine, cooking scraps, butchering leftovers, manufacturing byproducts, and plain old garbage. In a city like London circa 1350, we're talking about somewhere between 50,000 to 80,000 people, each producing roughly a pound of fecal matter per day, plus several pints of urine. Do the math, and you're looking at literal tons of human waste that has to go somewhere every single day forever. The solution? Well, solution is generous. The medieval approach was essentially, let gravity handle it. Most buildings had latrines, glorified holes in wooden platforms, that dropped waste either directly into the street, into a cesspit dug beneath the house, or if you were remarkably fortunate, into some kind of channel that led to a larger drainage system. These channels, when they existed at all, are what we're generously calling sewers. But calling them sewers gives them too much credit, honestly. They're more like accidental rivers of filth that happen to flow through gaps between buildings and under streets, eventually making their way to the nearest body of water. You're standing in one of these sewers now, and your first realization is that you can't actually stand up straight. The ceiling here is maybe 4.5 feet high, forcing you into a perpetual crouch that's already making your lower back scream. The tunnel is roughly 3 feet wide, its walls a combination of river stones mortared together with lime, when there's mortar at all. In many places, the stones are simply stacked, and you can see gaps where smaller stones have fallen away. Through these gaps, moisture seeps constantly, and occasionally, something decidedly solid drops through from the cesspit of a house above. The floor beneath your feet, and you're wearing boots because you're not completely suicidal, is covered in a layer of sediment that's accumulated over decades. This isn't mud. Mud would be a blessing. This is a compressed mixture of human and animal feces, decomposed food waste, mineral deposits from urine, silt, and organic matter in various states of decay. It's several inches deep in places, and with each step, it releases bubbles of gas that pop at the surface with sounds that range from gentle sighs to aggressive squelches. The consistency varies wildly. Sometimes it's almost solid, other times your foot sinks in past your ankle, and you have to genuinely pull to extract yourself, feeling the suction resist your every movement. Your second realization is that the darkness here is absolute. You've brought a torch, a bundle of resin-soaked rags wrapped around a stick, because you're not stupid enough to attempt this blind. But the light it provides is pitiful, creating a small bubble of flickering orange illumination that barely extends 6 feet in any direction. Beyond that bubble, nothing. Pure, complete darkness that seems to actively resist your light, swallowing it up like the void itself. You can hear things moving in that darkness, splashing and scraping and occasionally squeaking, but you can't see what's making those sounds. Your imagination, helpfully, is filling in possibilities, none of them comforting. The smell, though, oh the smell. You thought it was bad up at street level, but down here, it's transcendent in its awfulness. Your nose is attempting to shut down entirely, refusing to process the onslaught of olfactory information. There's the obvious base note of feces, both human and animal, fresh and aged, all fermenting together into a concentrated essence of wrongness. Layered on top of that is urine, so much urine, the ammonia making your eyes water and your throat burn. Then there's the rotting food waste, vegetables gone to mush, meat crawling with maggots, fish heads decomposing in the muck. Add in the chemical tang of waste from tanneries. More on that nightmare later. The metallic scent of blood from butchers' shops, and the sickly sweet smell of decay that you're trying very hard not to identify. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval people weren't ignorant about the health risks of all this filth. They understood on some level that proximity to waste made people sick. The miasma theory of disease, the idea that bad air caused illness, was the prevailing medical wisdom, and honestly, while they had the mechanism wrong, they weren't wrong that something about these conditions was deadly. City ordinances across Europe repeatedly tried to regulate waste disposal. London's 1357 ordinance forbade throwing waste into the Thames or into the streets. Paris had similar laws. Florence, Venice, Edinburgh, every major city had rules about where you could and couldn't dump your chamber pot. But here's the thing about medieval law enforcement. It was spotty at best. Fines existed, but they were small and catching violators was nearly impossible. More importantly, when you've got 50,000 people producing waste every day and maybe a few dozen gong farmers, the men who clean cesspits and sewers, working in the entire city, the infrastructure simply cannot keep up. It's not that medieval people were dirty by preference. They were trapped in a system that had no good solution to the fundamental problem of concentrated urban waste. Historians still argue whether medieval cities were actually dirtier than ancient Roman cities, or if our perception is skewed by the fact that Roman engineering was so much more impressive that we give them a pass. Roman sewers like the Cloaca Maxima were architectural achievements. Massive stone tunnels you could sail a boat through, with actual flowing water to carry waste away. Medieval sewers? They're what you build when Rome has fallen, the knowledge of hydraulic engineering has largely been lost, and you're working with whatever local materials and skills you can scrape together. You're moving forward now, deeper into the tunnel system, because staying in one place lets the cold seep into your bones. The temperature down here is surprisingly constant, cooler than summer streets, warmer than winter ones, hovering somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This might sound comfortable, but combined with the constant dampness, it's the kind of cold that works its way into your joints and makes you ache. Your clothes are already soaked from the moisture in the air and the splashes from your own movement. That dampness will never fully dry down here. Within hours, you'll feel chilled to your core, your teeth chattering, your fingers going numb despite the physical exertion of walking. The tunnel branches ahead, splitting into two directions, and you have to make a choice. There are no maps, no signs, no helpful markers to tell you which path leads where. The medieval city grew organically over centuries, and its sewer system, such as it is, grew the same way. Tunnels were added when someone needed to drain a new cesspit, connected to existing channels wherever convenient, with no overall plan or coordination. You could easily get lost down here, wandering in circles until your torch burns out and the darkness swallows you completely. People have died that way, their bodies found weeks later by gong farmers, if they're found at all. You choose the right-hand path, following the principle that at least consistency in your choices might help you navigate back. The tunnel here is even narrower, forcing you to turn sideways to squeeze through in places. The walls press against your chest and back, and you try not to think about what you're being pressed into. Somewhere above you, life continues in the medieval city. Merchants hawking goods, craftsmen working in their shops, children playing in the streets, priests leading prayers in stone churches. They're living their lives in daylight and relative freshness, and their waste is dripping down through the floors and walls to join you in this underground hell. You notice something moving in the water ahead. A dark shape, maybe a foot long, swimming against the current with surprising speed. It surfaces briefly, and you catch a glimpse of a pointed snout, small ears, and a long, naked tail. A rat. Not just any rat, but one of those medieval monsters that seems to have been living down here for generations, growing large on the endless supply of organic matter. This one is easily the size of a small cat, and when it looks at you, there's an intelligence in its eyes that's deeply unsettling. It doesn't flee from your torchlight. It simply watches you for a moment, then dives back under the surface and disappears into the murk. Where there's one rat, there are hundreds, thousands probably in a sewer system this size. They're one of the permanent residents down here, part of an ecosystem that has adapted to thrive in conditions that would kill most other creatures. Along with the rats, there are insects, beetles, flies, and their larvae by the millions, plus various parasites, bacteria, and pathogens that are absolutely delighted to make your acquaintance. You're essentially walking through a biological weapon, and every breath, every accidental splash that hits your face, every moment your hands touch these walls, you're exposing yourself to microscopic dangers that your 21st century body has zero experience fighting. Your torch flickers, and for one heart-stopping moment you think it might go out. If that happens, if you're plunged into complete darkness down here, you're done. You'd have to feel your way along the walls, blind and disoriented, hoping to find your way back to that entrance shaft. More likely, you'd panic, make a wrong turn, and end up hopelessly lost in this maze of filth. The flame steadies, though, and you breathe a sigh of relief that immediately makes you regret inhaling so deeply. That's another thing you're learning fast. Shallow breaths only, through your mouth, never through your nose if you can help it. You've been down here maybe 30 minutes, and already every part of you is screaming to get out. Your back aches from the constant crouch. Your legs are trembling from the effort of walking through the thick sediment. Your eyes are watering from the fumes. Your throat feels raw. Your skin itches where the splashes have touched bare flesh. And you've got another 23.5 hours to go if you're really committed to lasting a full day down here. Spoiler alert, you're not going to make it. Almost nobody would. This isn't a place built for human survival. It's a place built for waste disposal, maintained by people who had no other options, and tolerated by a society that understood it was necessary but preferred not to think too hard about what was happening beneath their feet. The tunnel you're following opens up slightly, and you find yourself in what might generously be called a junction, a space where 3 different channels converge into one slightly larger passage. Here, the ceiling rises to maybe 6 feet, allowing you to finally straighten your back with a series of disturbing cracks from your spine. But this momentary relief comes with a cost. You can now see the full architecture of this medieval engineering disaster, and it's somehow worse than you imagined. The walls here aren't consistently stone. In fact, large sections are just compacted earth, held back by wooden planks that are rotting from constant moisture exposure. These planks bow inward alarmingly, and you can see where some have already given way, leaving gaps through which soil and worse things spill into the channel. Some enterprising soul, probably decades ago, tried to reinforce one section with wattle and daub, the same material used in building construction. That's right. They literally plastered over a sewer wall with woven sticks and mud mixed with animal dung and straw. You can watch it slowly dissolving before your eyes, chunks occasionally plopping into the waste stream below. The ceiling above you is a patchwork of different materials and construction methods, telling the story of centuries of ad hoc repairs and additions. In some places, you see the careful stonework of what might have been an original Roman-era drain. The stones precisely cut and fitted together with almost no mortar, still holding strong after 1,000 years. Then, right next to this ancient craftsmanship, there's a section where someone has simply laid wooden planks across the gap and piled dirt on top. You can literally see the underside of the street above through gaps in the boards, and occasionally, a trickle of fresh dirt falls through, seasoning the waste below like the world's worst garnish. Medieval city planning, and again, planning is a charitable description, meant that sewers were built in whatever way was cheapest and easiest at the moment. Unlike Roman engineers who understood hydraulic principles, gradients, and the importance of proper flow rates, medieval builders were working with limited technical knowledge and even more limited budgets. Cities didn't fund sewer construction the way they might fund a cathedral or city walls. Instead, individual property owners were responsible for managing waste on their own land, which meant the quality of waste disposal varied wildly from one building to the next. What you're standing in right now is probably a combination of several different systems. That stone-lined section to your left, that might have been part of an original drainage system from centuries ago, possibly even predating the Norman conquest in England. The wooden-sided channel coming in from your right, that was likely added in the 1200s when someone built a new house and needed to connect their cesspit to something. And that earthen tunnel straight ahead, that could be as recent as last year, dug hastily to solve an immediate problem when someone's cesspit overflowed into their neighbor's cellar. The result is a system, if we can call it that, with wildly inconsistent dimensions, materials, and structural integrity. In some places, you're crawling through passages barely 2 feet high. In others, like this junction, you can almost stand upright. The width varies just as dramatically. You'll go from squeezing sideways through a narrow gap to suddenly finding yourself in an open space where multiple channels merge. There's no standardization, no quality control, no building codes ensuring that construction meets minimum safety standards. Here's a fun quirk that historians love to point out. Many medieval cities actually had laws requiring property owners to maintain the sewers adjacent to their buildings. London's 1357 sanitation laws specified that householders were responsible for keeping the gutters and drains in front of their properties clear. But maintaining meant different things to different people. Some conscientious property owners might actually hire someone to periodically clear blockages. Most people, though, did the absolute minimum, which is to say nothing at all until the backup became so severe it affected them personally. You notice something unsettling about the flow pattern here. The 3 channels converging at this junction don't actually merge smoothly. Instead, they create a turbulent mixing zone where the different streams collide, churning up sediment from the bottom and creating a foamy scum on the surface that's somehow even more disturbing than the liquid beneath. The flow from the left channel is moving faster, probably because it has a steeper gradient, and it's actually pushing against the flow from the right channel, creating an area of near-stagnant water in the corner where solid material has accumulated into a massive, festering pile. That pile deserves a closer look. Not because you want to, but because understanding what you're dealing with is crucial to survival. It's several feet high, a grotesque monument to waste accumulation, and it's composed of layers that tell a story if you can stomach reading it. The bottom layers are ancient, compressed into an almost solid mass of black, tarry substance. Moving up, you see more recent deposits. Recognizable chunks of food waste, fragments of fabric, people use cloth scraps instead of toilet paper, animal bones, and yes, those are definitely human bones mixed in there too. Bodies of executed criminals, stillborn babies, and people who died in poverty were sometimes dumped into sewers, and here they remain, slowly breaking down into component parts. The top layer of this pile is more liquid, still actively decomposing, generating heat from bacterial action. If you were insane enough to stick your hand into it, and please don't, you'd find it's actually warm, maybe 80 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, like the world's most disgusting compost heap. That warmth comes from billions of bacteria breaking down organic matter, and as a byproduct, they're releasing gases. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and various other compounds that are both toxic and flammable. You can see bubbles forming and popping on the surface of the pile, each one releasing a little puff of gas that adds to the already intolerable atmosphere. The really terrifying part? This pile is actually serving a structural function. It's built up against one wall to the point where it's probably the only thing holding back the earth behind that rotting wooden retaining wall. If you were to somehow remove the pile, not that you'd want to, there's a non-zero chance the entire wall would collapse, potentially bringing down part of the street above and definitely burying you under tons of soil and sewage. Medieval sewers exist in a delicate balance between complete collapse and barely functional, and that pile of filth is a load-bearing element in this nightmare architecture. Moving through this junction, you have to make another navigation decision. The channel straight ahead looks like the main passage. It's wider, and the flow is moving in that direction with some conviction. But there's also a smaller side channel, barely visible behind the pile, that splits off at an angle. Medieval sewer systems, such as they are, generally try to move waste toward the nearest river or stream. In London, that would be the Thames or one of its tributaries like the Fleet or the Walbrook. In Paris, it's the Seine. In Venice, well, Venice is its own special nightmare where the canals serve as both transportation routes and open sewers. But we'll save that horror for another night. You choose the main channel and immediately regret it because while it's wider, it's also deeper. The liquid waste here comes up to your knees, and you can feel things bumping against your legs as you wade through. The current is stronger too, and you have to lean forward slightly to keep your balance. The sediment on the bottom is treacherous, sometimes firm, sometimes suddenly giving way to send you lurching forward, windmilling your arms to avoid face planting into the medieval sewage. Your torch swings wildly with these movements, creating dancing shadows that make the entire tunnel seem to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. The walls in this section show evidence of actual engineering thought, which is somehow more depressing than the haphazard construction you've seen so far. Someone, at some point, tried to build this properly. The stones are larger here, probably each weighing 100 pounds or more, and they're fitted together with more care. There's an arch to the ceiling, distributing weight properly, and you can even see remnants of lime mortar in the joints. This was probably built during one of the periodic waves of civic improvement that swept through medieval cities, usually after a particularly bad plague outbreak or a visit from someone important who complained about the smell. But good intentions don't last forever, especially when maintenance is neglected. You can see where the mortar has dissolved away in places, leaving gaps between stones. Tree roots have worked their way through from above. Yes, tree roots, because some parts of the medieval city actually had trees, and their roots will seek water wherever they can find it, even if it's the most polluted water imaginable. These roots dangle from the ceiling like grotesque fingers, dripping with moisture, and you have to duck to avoid them. Touching them would be a mistake. They're covered in the same slime that coats everything else down here. Historians still argue whether the decline in urban sanitation from Roman times to the medieval period was as dramatic as we think, or if we're being too harsh on medieval engineering because we're comparing it to Rome at its absolute peak. Some scholars point out that Roman sewers, while impressive, mainly served public latrines and baths. Private homes still used cesspits and chamber pots. Others note that medieval cities eventually did develop functional waste management systems. They just took centuries to get there. Both perspectives have merit, but standing here in this tunnel, it's hard to be generous in your assessment. The passage ahead narrows again, and you spot something that makes your blood run cold. A grate. Someone has installed an iron grate across the tunnel, presumably to catch larger debris and prevent it from blocking downstream channels. It's a sensible idea in theory. In practice, it's created a dam of solid waste that's built up behind it, forcing the liquid to filter through gaps that are steadily growing smaller. The pile pressing against this grate is a horrible assemblage of everything that wouldn't fit through the bars. Dead animals, you count at least 3 cats, a dog, and what might be a pig. Large chunks of wood, broken pottery, scraps of fabric, and a disturbing number of bones. You're gonna have to climb over this. There's no other way forward. No side passage to take. Just this obstacle that needs to be surmounted. The grate itself is maybe 4 feet tall, extending from the waste surface to within a foot or 2 of the ceiling. The iron bars are thick, rusty, and disturbingly corroded in places. You test one with your hand, trying not to think about what that slimy coating on the metal might be, and it holds your weight. Barely. The climb is an exercise in controlled panic. Your hands find purchase on the bars, and you pull yourself up, your boots slipping on the slime-covered metal. Your face passes inches from the pile of debris pressed against the other side of the grate, close enough to see the maggots writhing in a dead cat's eye socket, close enough to identify the individual components of the compressed waste. The smell intensifies, if such a thing is even possible, a concentrated blast of decay that makes your stomach heave. You grit your teeth, focusing on the mechanics of movement. Hand here, foot there, pull, push, don't fall, whatever you do, don't fall into that pile. You make it over, dropping into the flow on the far side with a splash that sends droplets flying up to spatter against your face and neck. Your torch nearly goes out from the disturbance, and you have to shield it with your body for a few panic seconds while the flame recovers. When it does, you see that the passage ahead is actually in better condition than what you've encountered so far. The ceiling is properly vaulted stone, the walls are solid, and most surprisingly, there's evidence of recent maintenance. Newer mortar in some joints, replaced stones that don't quite match the original construction in color or size. This might have been a main drainage line, something that city authorities actually cared about keeping functional. Medieval cities did occasionally invest in major sewer infrastructure, especially after disasters. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is famous for destroying much of the city, but it also created an opportunity to rebuild with better planning, including improved waste management. Before that, though, cities muddled along with systems like this one, partly maintained main channels supplemented by a maze of poorly constructed auxiliary drains. You follow this better constructed section for several hundred feet, and the walking is almost pleasant by comparison to what you've experienced. The waist only comes up to your ankles here, the current is moderate, and the ceiling is high enough that you can walk normally. But this relative comfort is lulling you into complacency, making you forget a crucial truth about medieval sewers. They're fundamentally unstable environments where conditions can change in an instant. The first warning sign is a sound, a distant rumbling that you feel in your bones more than hear with your ears. Thunder? No, the quality is wrong, more sustained, and it's getting louder. The waste around your feet suddenly reverses direction, flowing backward for a few seconds before stopping entirely. That's when your modern brain, finally catching up to the danger, screams the answer. Flash flood. Someone upstream has just dumped a massive quantity of liquid into the system. Maybe a tannery releasing a day's worth of processing water, Maybe a brewery flushing out its vats. Maybe someone has broken through a blocked cesspit. Whatever the source, a wall of liquid is racing toward you through these narrow tunnels, and you have seconds to react. You run. There's no thought involved, just pure survival instinct driving your legs to pump harder than they've moved in years, splashing through the ankle-deep waste with a desperation that momentarily overrides your disgust. The rumbling grows louder, echoing off the stone walls, amplifying until it sounds like the earth itself is angry. You spot a small alcove in the wall ahead, probably a side channel or maintenance access, and you throw yourself into it just as the surge hits. The wall of liquid slams into the main passage with a roar, instantly transforming that moderate ankle-deep flow into a churning torrent that fills the tunnel halfway to the ceiling. It's not just water. It's a slurry of waste, debris, and chemical runoff moving with terrifying force. You watch from your alcove as chunks of solid matter race past. Wooden planks, dead animals, what looks like an entire chair, and objects you can't even identify tumbling in the current. If you'd been caught in that, you'd have been swept away, battered against the walls, possibly drowned, certainly injured beyond your ability to continue. The surge lasts maybe 3 minutes, though it feels like an eternity. Gradually, the flow decreases, the level drops, and the rumbling fades to a gurgle. You emerge from your alcove on shaking legs, your heart hammering so hard you can feel it in your throat. That was nearly it. Killed in a medieval sewer by someone dumping their day's industrial waste without a thought for anyone downstream. Welcome to life in the underbelly of a medieval city, where your survival depends on factors completely outside your control. This little incident brings us to the other inhabitants of these tunnels, the ones who actually work down here by choice, or more accurately, by desperate necessity. The gong farmers, rakers, and night soil collectors who maintain this system are a breed apart. Members of a profession so reviled that they're often legally required to live outside city walls and can only work at night. Yet they're absolutely essential. Without them, the entire system would back up within weeks, cesspits would overflow into houses, and disease would spread even faster than it already does. The term gong farmer comes from gong, an Old English word for privy or latrine. These men, and they're almost exclusively men, are hired to clean out cesspits, those chambers dug beneath houses where waste accumulates over months or years. It's backbreaking, nauseating work that involves climbing down into confined spaces filled with decades of compressed fecal matter and manually shoveling it into buckets to be hauled up and carted away. The pay is surprisingly good, precisely because almost nobody is willing to do this job, but there's a catch. Gong farmers have notoriously short lifespans. Here's a grim statistic that historians have pieced together from medieval records. The average gong farmer who worked regularly in London's cesspits and sewers lived to maybe 40 years old, and that's if they were lucky. Many died much younger, either from accidents, drowning in waste, tunnel collapses, asphyxiation from toxic gases, or from the cumulative effects of constant exposure to pathogens. Their life expectancy was perhaps 15 years shorter than the already dismal average for medieval laborers, and that's saying something in an era where dying at 50 made you a respectable old age. You might encounter a gong farmer down here, working by the light of their own torch, and the experience would be surreal. These men develop an almost supernatural ability to navigate the tunnels in near-total darkness, moving through the waste with a practiced efficiency that looks like a macabre dance. They know which sections are stable, which are prone to collapse, where the deepest pools are, where the gas pockets accumulate. This knowledge is passed down from master to apprentice. Yes, gong farming was sometimes a family trade, which tells you everything about medieval social mobility, and it's the only thing keeping them alive in this environment. The tools of their trade are brutally simple. Shovels with extra-long handles, buckets reinforced with iron bands, hooks for pulling out larger debris, and occasionally a pole for testing the depth of waste or the stability of the ground ahead. Some gong farmers work in pairs or small teams, especially when cleaning out the larger cesspits beneath wealthy households. They develop their own jargon, their own signals, ways of communicating in the darkness when sound carries strangely and echoes confuse direction. But it's not just the gong farmers you might meet down here. There are the rakers, street cleaners who technically work above ground but sometimes descend into the upper layers of the drainage system to clear blockages. There are tanners workers, flushing hides and dumping processing chemicals that turn entire sections of the sewer a vivid, unnatural blue or green. There are butchers' apprentices disposing of animal parts that even medieval diets won't stomach. Diseased organs, rotted meat, the contents of intestines, all of it heaved into the nearest drain with the assumption that it'll become someone else's problem downstream. And then there are the rats. Oh, the rats deserve their own discussion because they're not just inhabitants of this space. They're the dominant species, the true rulers of the medieval sewer ecosystem. The ones you see scurrying at the edges of your torchlight are just the scouts, the brave or hungry individuals willing to risk exposure. Behind them, in the darkness, in the side passages and the spaces between walls, there are hundreds more, thousands more. An entire civilization of rodents that has adapted perfectly to this environment. Medieval rats weren't like modern rats, or rather, they were the unselected, uncontrolled ancestors of modern rats, and they were bigger, meaner, and far more aggressive. A large male could easily reach 2 pounds, maybe more if food was plentiful, which in a sewer system it always was. These aren't the timid creatures that flee from humans. These are animals that view humans as just another large mammal, possibly a threat, possibly prey if you're injured or unconscious. There are documented cases of sleeping gong farmers being bitten by rats bold enough to test whether this motionless meat thing is edible. The rats serve a function in the ecosystem, though. They consume organic waste, breaking down material that would otherwise accumulate even faster than it already does. They're like living recycling machines, processing the city's refuse into rat droppings and rat babies, which then become food for other rats in a beautifully efficient, if deeply disgusting cycle. But they're also disease vectors of legendary efficiency, carrying fleas that carry bacteria, spreading pathogens through their urine and feces, which mixes with human waste in a pathogenic soup that medieval medicine has no ability to combat. You hear a splash behind you, larger than the constant background noise of dripping and trickling, and you spin around with your torch raised. A rat, a truly massive specimen, easily the largest you've seen yet, sits on a stone ledge at the edge of your light, grooming itself with an almost feline composure. It looks at you with dark, intelligent eyes that seem to be evaluating you, measuring whether you're a threat or just another temporary visitor to its domain. After a moment, it returns to its grooming, dismissing you as irrelevant. The casual disrespect is somehow more unnerving than if it had hissed or charged. But rats aren't the only animals down here. You'd be amazed what ends up in a medieval sewer system. Pigs, for instance. Cities like London had ordinances against allowing pigs to roam the streets, but enforcement was spotty, and pigs are clever enough to find their way into drainage channels where they root through the waste looking for edible scraps. A pig trapped in a sewer tunnel is a terrifying thing. Several hundred pounds of muscle and aggression, scared, unable to turn around in the confined space, and willing to charge right through you to find a way out. Dogs occasionally end up down here too, either fallen through gaps in the street or, more disturbingly, thrown down alive by owners who didn't want them anymore. Cats are frequent visitors, both as hunters pursuing rats and as corpses disposed of by whatever means was most convenient. There's an entire food chain operating in these tunnels. Rats eat waste, cats and weasels eat rats, larger predators eat cats, and everything eventually dies and becomes food for the insects and bacteria that form the foundation of this underground ecosystem. Speaking of insects, let's talk about what's flying around your torch right now. The medieval sewer is paradise for flies, houseflies, blowflies, flesh flies, and various other species that have evolved to thrive in exactly this kind of environment. They breed in the waste by the millions, laying eggs that hatch into maggots that feed on the organic matter before pupating and emerging as the next generation. The life cycle is measured in days, sometimes just a week from egg to adult, meaning the population can explode incredibly rapidly when conditions are right. Those flies landing on you right now, they were probably feeding on the decomposing matter in that pile you climbed over earlier. Now they're walking across your face, your hands, any exposed skin, and they're carrying bacteria on their feet and bodies. Medieval people understood the connection between flies and disease. They called them disease bearers in various languages, but without microscopes or germ theory, they had no way to understand the mechanism. They just knew that where there were many flies, disease often followed, and they were absolutely correct. Historians still argue whether the Black Death, the plague pandemic that killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, was primarily spread by rat fleas or if human fleas and lice played a larger role. Recent research suggests it might have been a combination, with different transmission routes dominating in different contexts. But there's no argument about the fact that urban sanitation conditions created an ideal environment for plague to spread once it arrived. The rats, the fleas, the crowded conditions, the lack of hygiene knowledge. It was a perfect storm of pathogenic potential. You've been noticing an itch developing over the past hour, a general sense of crawling on your skin that you've been trying to ignore. Now it's impossible to dismiss. You look down at your arms in the torchlight and see them. Lice. Not just one or two, but dozens of tiny parasites that have apparently decided you're the warmest, most appealing host they've encountered recently. They must have dropped from the ceiling or transferred from the walls when you steadied yourself, or possibly they've been on you since the beginning and you're only now noticing them in sufficient numbers to feel. Medieval people were intimately familiar with lice. Body lice, head lice, pubic lice. They were constant companions in an era when bathing was infrequent and clothes were rarely washed in hot water. The wealthy might have servants whose job included delousing their master's clothing, picking out the insects one by one and crushing them between thumbnails. The poor just lived with them, accepting the constant itching and occasional disease transmission as part of life. Down here in the sewers, though, the lice population reaches epic proportions, feeding on rats, on gong farmers, on any warm-blooded creature they can access. You try brushing them off, which mostly just redistributes them to different parts of your clothing. Killing them individually would take hours and be ultimately futile when you're surrounded by an environment where millions more are waiting. This is your life now, for as long as you remain in this medieval sewer. Constantly itching, constantly aware of tiny insects crawling across your skin, constantly fighting the urge to strip off all your clothes and scrub yourself raw, which would be a disaster because the cold would kill you almost as fast as the diseases. The passage ahead splits again, and this time you can hear something different from one of the branches, voices. Human voices, echoing strangely through the tunnel acoustics, but definitely people. You move toward the sound, curious despite yourself about who else would be down here. As you round a bend, your torchlight illuminates a scene straight from a medieval nightmare painting. 3 men are working in a widened section of the sewer, knee-deep in waste, shoveling material into leather buckets that a 4th man hauls up through a shaft to the surface. These are gong farmers, and you're witnessing them in their natural element. They've stripped to the waist despite the cold, their skin covered in grime and worse, muscles standing out in sharp relief as they work. The smell intensifies. Fresh disturbance of the waste releases gases that have been trapped beneath, and they work with cloths tied around their faces, though you can't imagine that provides much protection. They notice you, and for a moment, there's a tense silence. You're an intruder in their workspace, and more than that, you're clearly not one of them. Your clothes, though now filthy, mark you as someone who doesn't belong here. The largest of them, a man who might be 40 but looks 60, with gaps in his teeth and a scar across his cheek, finally speaks. "Lost, are you? Or just stupid?" His accent is thick, the Middle English difficult to parse even if you've studied the language. You try to explain that you're just passing through, exploring, and the expressions on their faces shift from suspicion to something like pity mixed with contempt. One of the younger men laughs, not unkindly. "Won't last till dawn," he says to his companions, not to you. Look at him shaking already, and it's summer. It's true, you are shaking from cold, from exhaustion, from the cumulative stress of everything you've experienced so far. The scarred man shrugs. "Main channel's that way." He gestures with his shovel, pointing deeper into the darkness. "But there's a collapse about 200 paces on. Either go back the way you came or take the upper branch at the next fork. And watch for the tanner's drain. It runs hot and will strip the skin off your legs if you wade through it." With that, they return to their work, dismissing you as irrelevant to their lives. They have quotas to meet, cesspits to empty, and you're just another fool who'll either find your way out or become another body for them to find eventually. You continue on, chastened by the encounter and newly aware of how utterly unprepared you are for this environment. These men have spent years adapting to conditions that you've been struggling with for just a few hours. They know every trick for survival, every danger to avoid, and even they die young, worn down by the relentless toxicity of their workplace. What chance do you have? The warning about the tanner's drain sticks in your mind as you navigate the next section of tunnel, and you soon understand why the gong farmer mentioned it so specifically. You reach the fork he described, and from the upper branch you can hear a rushing sound, while the lower branch, the one you're currently in, shows wet marks on the wall suggesting recent high water. You take the upper branch, climbing carefully up a crude stone stairway that's more like a series of uneven ledges than actual steps, and you emerge into a different kind of nightmare altogether. The air here hits you like a physical blow, and somehow it's worse than anything you've encountered so far. That sharp, chemical reek of ammonia you've been smelling since you descended? That was amateur hour compared to this. Your eyes immediately start streaming tears, your throat closes up, and you have to suppress a cough that would mean breathing even more deeply of this toxic atmosphere. This is the Tanner's District drainage, where the leatherworking shops above flush their processing chemicals directly into the sewer system with no treatment, no filtration, no concern for what happens to the concentrated brew of horror they're creating. Let's talk about medieval tanning for a moment, because understanding the process helps explain why this particular section of sewer is legendary even among gong farmers as a place to avoid. Tanning, the process of turning animal hides into usable leather, requires breaking down the proteins in the skin and preserving it against decay. The medieval method involved soaking hides in increasingly strong solutions of chemicals, and those chemicals were chosen for availability and effectiveness, not safety or environmental friendliness. First, the hides are soaked in water to clean them. Then they're treated with lime to remove hair and flesh. That lime water, highly caustic and loaded with dissolved tissue, gets dumped down the drain. Next comes the purification stage, where the hides are soaked in solutions of animal dung. Yes, dung, because the enzymes in it help soften the leather. Pigeon dung was particularly prized, but dog feces worked too, creating a slurry that tanners called pure, with the kind of irony that only people who work with excrement for a living can muster. That also goes down the drain. Then comes the actual tanning, using solutions made from oak bark, sumac, or other plant materials rich in tannins. These baths turn progressively darker and stronger over months of use, becoming thick, brown liquids that look like coffee, but are absolutely not something you'd want to drink. Finally, there's the finishing process with various oils and fats to make the leather supple. All of this, every stage of the process, generates waste that gets flushed into the sewer system, creating a chemical cocktail that's both toxic and corrosive. The tunnel walls here show the damage. The mortar has been eaten away in places, leaving gaps between stones where the acidic runoff has dissolved the lime binding. The stones themselves are stained in layers of different colors, browns, greens, even a sickly yellow-white where lime deposits have built up. The liquid flowing through this channel isn't the murky brown of normal sewage. It's a disturbing reddish-brown, almost rust-colored, and it steams slightly where it pours from a pipe protruding from the wall about 10 feet ahead. That steam is what the Gong farmer meant by runs hot. The tanning process generates heat, and the runoff from the tanning pits can be surprisingly warm. Not boiling, but hot enough to scald if you're exposed for too long. And the chemicals in it are far worse than simple hot water. The lime is caustic enough to burn skin on contact. The tannins will stain anything they touch a permanent brown. The organic compounds from the dung and decomposing tissue create an environment so hostile that even bacteria struggle to survive, which is why this section of the sewer has less of the biological slime you've seen elsewhere. Nothing wants to grow here. You try to skirt around the worst of it, staying as far from the central flow as possible, but the tunnel is narrow here and there's no way to avoid all contact. The waste laps at your boots, and you can feel the heat even through the leather. Worse, splashes hit your clothes, and where they land, the fabric starts to feel somehow slippery, the fibers breaking down in real time from the chemical assault. Your skin, where a few drops have landed on exposed areas, begins to itch and then burn, a sensation that starts mild but builds quickly to genuine pain. This is what the Gong farmer meant about stripping skin. Prolonged exposure to this runoff would cause chemical burns, the kind that don't heal cleanly and leave permanent scars. Medieval tanners themselves often showed the evidence of their trade on their hands and arms, patches of discolored, roughened skin where repeated exposure had damaged the tissue. And they wore protective gear, crude leather aprons and gloves. You're in regular clothes that are rapidly disintegrating, and you need to get out of this section immediately. You hurry forward, trying not to slip on the chemically slick floor, and you spot another side passage branching off to the right. You take it without hesitation, desperate to escape the chemical zone, and find yourself in a blessedly normal section of sewer, which is a phrase you never thought you'd use. Normal here means just regular sewage, human and animal waste, the standard medieval filth. After the tanning runoff, it seems almost wholesome by comparison, which tells you how thoroughly this experience has recalibrated your standards of tolerable. You stop to catch your breath, and that's when you notice the change in how you're breathing. It's becoming harder, requiring more conscious effort. At first, you think it's just exhaustion. You've been down here for several hours now, constantly moving, constantly stressed. But then you recognize the symptoms. The air quality is degrading, oxygen levels are dropping, and toxic gases are building up. You've wandered into a section with poor ventilation, and your body is starting to suffocate. Here's the thing about medieval sewers that makes them death traps. They produce gases that are both toxic and displacement gases, meaning they push out the oxygen you need to breathe. Methane is the big one. Produced by anaerobic bacteria breaking down organic matter, it's lighter than air and tends to accumulate in high pockets near ceilings. It's also highly flammable, which is why Gong farmers knew to be careful with open flames. But methane itself isn't particularly toxic. You can breathe fairly high concentrations without immediate harm, though the reduced oxygen will make you lightheaded. The real killer is hydrogen sulfide, which is heavier than air and pools in low areas. It's the gas that gives sewers their characteristic rotten egg smell. But that smell is actually a warning sign that dissipates when concentrations get truly dangerous. At low concentrations, it just smells bad and causes eye irritation, which you've been experiencing all along. At moderate concentrations, it causes headaches, nausea, and respiratory distress. At high concentrations, it paralyzes your respiratory system, you lose consciousness within seconds, and death follows shortly after. It's called sewer gas in modern terminology, and it kills sanitation workers even today when safety protocols are ignored. Carbon dioxide is another culprit, also heavier than air, also an asphyxiant. It's produced in large quantities by the decomposition process, and it accumulates in poorly ventilated spaces. Add in carbon monoxide from your torch. Yes, that torch you're carrying for light is actively consuming oxygen and producing poisonous gas. And you've got an atmospheric cocktail that's slowly killing you with every breath. The symptoms you're experiencing are classic. Slight dizziness, a feeling of pressure in your head, difficulty focusing your vision. Your torch flame is burning slightly less brightly, the flame smaller and more yellow than it should be, which is a coal miner's warning sign that the air is bad. Medieval gong farmers knew about this. They'd lower a candle into a cesspit before descending, and if the flame went out, they knew the air was poisonous. You're already inside the danger zone, and you need to move to better ventilated area or you'll collapse. You push forward, trying to move quickly but finding that your coordination is off. You stumble over irregularities in the floor that you should have easily avoided, your depth perception skewed by the lack of oxygen reaching your brain. The tunnel seems to stretch on forever, and you're starting to panic, which makes you breathe harder, which makes the problem worse. It's a vicious cycle, and you're losing. Then you see it. A shaft of light ahead, dusty and faint but definitely daylight, filtering down through some opening to the surface. You stumble toward it like a drowning person reaching for air, which is essentially what you are. The shaft is a vertical channel, probably a ventilation shaft or perhaps just a gap where street construction has left an opening. Whatever its purpose, it's pulling fresher air down from above, and you position yourself directly beneath it, gulping in breaths that, while still contaminated with sewer gases, at least contain enough oxygen to keep you conscious. You stay there for several minutes, just breathing, letting your system recover. Your head clears slowly, the dizziness fading to a manageable level. This is another lesson in sewer survival. Know where the ventilation points are, and use them regularly. The gong farmers who survive longest are the ones who understand airflow, who can read the subtle signs that indicate whether a space is safe to enter. They develop an almost instinctive sense for it, the way miners can sense when a shaft is about to collapse. You don't have that sense, and it nearly killed you. Looking up through the ventilation shaft, you can see a circle of sky, though sky is generous. It's the narrow strip visible between buildings that lean so close together they almost touch. Still, it's daylight, it's the surface world. It's everything you took for granted before descending into this underground hell. You can hear street sounds filtering down. Voices haggling in a market, a cart rumbling past, someone singing. Life is happening up there, normal medieval life, and it's only 20 feet away but might as well be 1,000 miles for all the good it does you. Historians still argue whether medieval people fully understood the dangers of sewer gases or if they just knew empirically that bad air in confined spaces could kill. There are documented cases of gong farmers dying in cesspits. London records from 1326 mention a Richard the Raker who fell through rotten planks into his own cesspit and suffocated before he could be pulled out. A death so ironic and horrible that it's been remembered for 700 years. Coroners' reports from medieval cities occasionally mention workers found dead in sewers with no obvious injuries, which modern forensic experts interpret as likely gas asphyxiation deaths. The reality is that medieval people understood cause and effect even without understanding mechanism. They knew that stirring up the bottom of a cesspit could release gases that killed. They knew that working in confined spaces with poor air circulation was dangerous. They knew that flames going out meant the air was bad. This practical knowledge, passed down through apprenticeship and hard-won experience, saved countless lives even if the workers couldn't explain the chemistry behind methane and hydrogen sulfide production. You're feeling better now, strong enough to continue, and you make a mental note of this ventilation shaft's location. If things get desperate, if you need to escape the sewers quickly, this might be a viable exit point. You'd need to climb somehow. The walls are rough stone that might offer handholds, and the shaft is narrow enough that you could potentially chimney climb it, pressing your back against one wall and your feet against the other. It's risky, you could fall and break bones or worse, but it's an option to remember. Moving on, you notice that your torch is burning lower, the fuel starting to run out. This is a problem you should have anticipated but didn't, because you're not a medieval person accustomed to managing limited light sources. The torch probably has another hour of life at best, maybe less, and when it goes out, you'll be in absolute darkness with no way to relight it. Medieval gong farmers carried flint and steel, plus backup torches or candles, and they knew how to navigate by touch if necessary. You have none of those skills or supplies. The panic starts creeping back, but you force it down. Panic kills in environments like this, makes you stupid, makes you waste energy, makes you make mistakes. You need to think clearly. The ventilation shaft behind you lets in light, so if you could stay near it, you'd have some illumination. Or you could try to navigate toward an exit, using the general principle that water flows downhill and sewers therefore usually lead to rivers. Or you could find another ventilation shaft, another connection to the surface, and try to climb out. Before you can decide, you hear something that freezes your blood. A long, low moan echoing through the tunnels, almost too deep to be human but definitely coming from a living throat. It's distant, hard to pinpoint direction with the way sound bounces off stone walls. But it's definitely there, definitely real, definitely something you don't want to meet in the dark. Medieval sewers attracted the desperate and the outcast. Criminals hiding from authorities, homeless people seeking shelter, the mentally ill who'd been driven out of communities. Not all of them survived long in this environment, but those who did became something less than human, adapted to the darkness, eating whatever they could scavenge, avoiding the gong farmers and anyone else who might represent authority or threat. There are stories, probably exaggerated but maybe not entirely fiction, of sewer dwellers in medieval London and Paris, people who'd been living underground so long they couldn't tolerate daylight anymore. The moan comes again, closer now, and you make your decision. Move away from that sound, quickly and quietly. You splash through the waste as carefully as you can, trying to minimize noise, your torch held low to reduce how visible you are from a distance. The tunnel branches, and you take the path that seems to lead away from the source of that disturbing sound. You're learning, finally, how to move through this environment. Your balance is better, your breathing more controlled, your tolerance for the omnipresent filth slightly improved. But you're also wearing down. Tired, cold, hungry, thirsty with a thirst you absolutely cannot slake from any water source down here. The human body can survive about 3 days without water, less if you're exerting yourself and losing fluids through sweat. You've been down here perhaps 5 or 6 hours, and already you're feeling the effects of dehydration combined with the constant chemical irritation of your respiratory system. This is the reality that gong farmers faced every working day. The cumulative damage of exposure, the wearing down of their bodies' systems, the slow poisoning that no medieval medicine could counteract. They tried to protect themselves. Cloths soaked in vinegar over the face, leather aprons, boots sealed with tar, but ultimately, they were fighting a losing battle against an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. And you, with your modern immune system that's never been challenged by medieval diseases, your body that expects clean water and clean air, your mind that understands germ theory but can't actually see the billions of pathogens surrounding you, you're even more vulnerable than they were. Every breath, every moment of skin contact with contaminated surfaces, every accidental splash that hits your face is exposing you to dangers your body has no evolved defenses against. The question isn't whether you'll get sick from this experience. The question is how sick, how fast, and whether you'll survive it. The tunnel you've chosen opens into a larger chamber, and the change is immediately apparent in the acoustics. Your footsteps no longer echo tightly, but instead produce a hollow, reverberating sound that suggests significant space. Your torch, dim as it's getting, reveals what appears to be a collection point where multiple channels converge, creating a pool of waste that's deeper than anything you've encountered so far. The liquid here is nearly still, a dark mirror reflecting your torchlight in oily patterns that shift and swirl with surface tension. This is, essentially, a medieval settling tank, though calling it engineered would be far too generous. It's more likely a natural low point where the channels happen to meet, and over decades or centuries, it's become a basin where the heaviest materials settle out of the flow. The depth is impossible to gauge, could be 3 feet, could be 10, and testing it by wading in would be suicide. Instead, you edge around the perimeter, where a narrow ledge provides precarious footing. The smell here achieves a new peak of intensity, because still water allows gases to build up and concentrate rather than being carried away by current. You can actually see the gas bubbles rising to the surface, some small and insignificant, others large enough that when they pop, they splash droplets of liquid that arc through the air like tiny, disgusting fountains. Each pop releases a concentrated puff of hydrogen sulfide, methane, and compounds you can't identify but which make your eyes water even more than they already have been. What makes this particular chamber noteworthy isn't just the pool. It's what you're starting to notice floating in it. Objects bob on the surface, some half-submerged, others fully visible in your torchlight. There are the expected things. Wooden barrels that have lost their structural integrity and split apart, ceramic vessels that must have fallen or been dumped from above, unidentifiable masses of compacted organic matter. But there are also things that make your stomach clench. Shapes that are disturbingly human in proportion, bundles wrapped in cloth that have come partially unwound to reveal what they were meant to conceal. Medieval cities disposed of bodies in sewers more often than official records acknowledge. Stillborn infants, miscarried fetuses, sometimes executed criminals or murder victims that someone wanted disappeared. The sewers accepted everything with equal indifference. The practice was technically illegal in most places, but enforcement was impossible when you could dump something down a drain shaft at night and have it be a mile away by morning, unidentifiable and mixed with all the other refuse. You don't look too closely at those bundles. Some knowledge is better left unconfirmed, and you have enough nightmares accumulating without adding that particular imagery to the collection. Instead, you focus on navigating the ledge, which is treacherous with slime and made more dangerous by the irregular surface. Medieval masons didn't bother smoothing surfaces that would never be seen, so the stones jut out at odd angles, creating trip hazards that you have to negotiate in dim, flickering light. Halfway around the pool, your boot slips on a particularly slimy section, and for one heart-stopping moment, you're teetering on the edge, arms windmilling, torch swinging wildly and nearly extinguishing itself. You manage to catch your balance by slamming your hand against the wall, which means plunging your palm into a coating of slime so thick it's almost gelatinous. The texture is indescribable, simultaneously slippery and sticky, cool and somehow alive feeling, like touching something that might start moving on its own at any moment. You pull your hand back with a gasp of revulsion, and long strings of the slime stretch between your palm and the wall before finally breaking. Your torch illuminates your hand, and you see that the slime is a sickly greenish-brown, streaked with darker threads that might be fungal growth or might be something worse. It's already soaking through your skin, carrying who knows what pathogens directly into your bloodstream through the inevitable small cuts and abrasions that everyone has on their hands. This is how diseases spread in medieval cities, not just through obvious contamination, but through 1,000 tiny exposures that accumulate until your immune system is overwhelmed. The water sources in medieval cities, you're learning firsthand, were fundamentally compromised. Wells were often dug too shallow, sometimes right next to cesspits, and the porous soil allowed contamination to seep from one to the other. Rivers that served as drinking water sources also served as sewers, the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Tiber in Rome. Cities would draw water from upstream and discharge waste downstream, which worked fine if you were the only city on the river. But with multiple cities and towns along every major waterway, someone's downstream was always someone else's upstream. Here's a grim detail that historians have documented. Medieval brewing actually saved countless lives, not because people were drunk all the time, but because the brewing process involved boiling water. Beer and ale were safer to drink than water, not because the alcohol killed germs, the alcohol content was usually too low, but because the boiling step killed pathogens. People who drank primarily beer had better survival rates than those who drank water, though obviously nobody understood why at the time. You've made it around the pool and found an exit tunnel, but before you can enter it, something in the water catches your attention. There's movement, a rippling that's too regular to be just gas bubbles, and too purposeful to be random current. Something is swimming in that pool. Something large enough to displace water visibly. And it's moving toward you. Your rational mind insists it's probably just a rat, maybe a large one that fell in and is trying to get out. But your lizard brain, the part that kept your ancestors alive through actual dangers, is screaming that this is wrong, that the size and movement pattern don't match anything harmless. You back away from the edge, torch extended toward the water, trying to get a glimpse of whatever is down there. It surfaces about 10 feet from the edge, a pale, elongated shape that's definitely not a rat. For a moment, you can't process what you're seeing, because it doesn't match any category your brain has filed under things that live in sewers. Then it clicks. It's an eel. A massive eel, probably 3 feet long and as thick as your wrist. Its body a ghostly white from living in complete darkness. Its eyes, when they reflect your torchlight, are filmy and possibly blind, adapted to navigate by smell and vibration rather than sight. Medieval sewers, especially those that connected to rivers, occasionally harbored fish and eels that had made their way up from open water. The eels, in particular, thrived in the low-oxygen, high-organic content environment, feeding on whatever waste provided protein. They grew large on this diet, larger than their river-dwelling cousins, becoming apex predators in the underground ecosystem. Gong farmers told stories of eels that could bite through boot leather, though whether those stories were true or exaggerated by the universal human tendency to make dangers more dramatic is open to debate. This one seems content to ignore you, swimming lazy circles in the pool before diving back down into the murk. You're happy to extend it the same courtesy, getting as far from that water as quickly as your exhausted legs will carry you. The exit tunnel is smaller than you'd like, forcing you back into that uncomfortable crouch, but at least it's moving water rather than stagnant, which suggests better air quality and fewer nightmare creatures lurking in pools. The sound of running water grows louder as you progress, and you realize you're approaching something significant. Maybe a major confluence, maybe even the outfall where this particular sewer system dumps into a river. The prospect is simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it represents a route to the surface, to fresh air and daylight. Terrifying because medieval sewer outfalls were often partially submerged, creating a situation where you'd have to swim through contaminated water to reach the outside world, assuming the current didn't just sweep you away into the river proper. But before you reach whatever lies ahead, you need to address an increasingly urgent problem. Your torch is dying. The flame has diminished to barely more than a flicker, casting almost no useful light, and you can feel the heat from it fading. You have maybe 5 more minutes before it goes out entirely, leaving you in darkness that your 21st century mind can barely comprehend. You've lived your entire life in a world with electric lights, where true darkness is a novelty you can end with the flip of a switch. Down here, darkness would be absolute, disorienting, potentially fatal. Medieval people understood darkness in a way we don't. They lived with it every night, navigating by moonlight when available, by memory and touch when not. Their night vision was probably better than yours, their brains more accustomed to processing minimal visual information. Even so, they feared the dark, telling stories of creatures that lived in it, warning children not to wander at night, carrying lights whenever possible. The darkness in a medieval sewer, though that was darkness that even they respected and feared. Your torch gives one final, defiant flicker and goes out. The darkness that descends is total, complete, absolute. It's not just the absence of light. It's the presence of darkness so thick you can feel it pressing against your eyes. You wave your hand in front of your face and see nothing. Not a shadow, not a hint of movement, just endless black that your brain tries to fill with phantom images that aren't really there. This is what gong farmers experienced if their lights failed, and this is why so many of them died, disoriented and lost in tunnels they might have navigated successfully with vision. You force yourself to stay calm, though every instinct is screaming panic. You're still breathing, still standing, still alive. The darkness can't hurt you directly. It's just the absence of light. But what the darkness conceals, what it prevents you from seeing, that's where the real danger lies. You could step into a deep pool and drown. You could walk face first into a wall and break your nose or worse. You could take a wrong turn into a dead end and never find your way out. You remember the ventilation shaft from earlier, the daylight streaming down, and realize that you've moved too far from it to navigate back by memory. The tunnels twist and branch, and without light, you have no way to maintain orientation. You could try moving forward, feeling your way along the walls, but that's how people get hopelessly lost. You could stay here, hoping someone finds you, but who would come? The gong farmers work at night, and you have no way to know what time it is or how long until they begin their shifts. Then you notice it, the faintest suggestion of light ahead, so dim you're not even sure it's real at first. You stare at it, trying to determine if your eyes are inventing it, manufacturing phantom light because your brain can't accept total darkness. But no, it persists, a slight lessening of the absolute black, a hint that somewhere ahead there's a source of illumination, however faint. You move toward it, one hand on the wall for guidance, feet testing each step before committing your weight. The walk is agonizingly slow, every sense heightened by the lack of vision. You hear water dripping, rats squeaking, your own breathing echoing slightly off the tunnel walls. You feel the texture of stone changing under your fingers, smooth in some places, rough in others, occasionally intersecting with the gap of a missing stone or the intrusion of a tree root. You smell the constant background reek of sewage, though your nose has adapted somewhat, no longer reacting as violently as it did hours ago. The light grows incrementally stronger, and now you can make out vague shapes, the outline of the tunnel, the darker patch that indicates the water flow, the irregular texture of the walls. It's still incredibly dim, probably equivalent to deep twilight on the surface, but after absolute darkness, it feels like blazing sunshine. Your eyes are so light-starved that even this minimal illumination seems generous. You round a corner and find the source. Another ventilation shaft, this one wider than the previous one, and from the quality of light, you'd guess it's late afternoon on the surface. The sun must be at an angle that allows more direct light to penetrate down here, creating this blessed pocket of semi-visibility. You could stay here using this light to rest, to recover, to think through your next move. But you're also becoming aware of other problems that have been building throughout your time underground. You're desperately thirsty, your mouth feels lined with paste, your tongue is swollen, and swallowing is difficult. You're hungry, though the environment has thoroughly suppressed your appetite, creating a strange disconnect where your body needs food but your mind rejects the very concept of eating anything. You're cold, the constant dampness having leached away your body heat, and you're shivering almost constantly now, which is burning calories and making you even colder in a vicious cycle. Most concerning, you're starting to feel feverish. Your skin feels simultaneously too hot and too cold, you have a headache building behind your eyes, and your thoughts are slightly fuzzy at the edges. These are early signs of infection, your immune system ramping up to fight the innumerable pathogens you've been exposed to. Medieval people who worked in sewers built up some resistance through constant exposure. Their immune systems learned to recognize and fight the common threats. Your immune system has no such advantage. It's encountering bacteria, parasites, and viruses it has never seen before, and it's mounting a desperate defense that's making you feel increasingly unwell. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually more resistant to disease than we are, or if we're misinterpreting high childhood mortality rates. The theory goes that medieval people who survived childhood had immune systems that were battle-hardened by constant exposure to pathogens, making them relatively robust as adults. Modern people, by contrast, grow up in relatively sterile environments, which means our immune systems are naive, ready to learn, but unprepared for the onslaught of medieval-era contamination. Drop a modern person into medieval conditions, and they'd likely get catastrophically sick very quickly. That's what's happening to you right now. Your body is trying to fight infections from multiple sources simultaneously: bacterial infections from fecal contamination, parasitic infections from water contact, respiratory infections from the gases you've been breathing, skin infections from the constant abrasion and chemical exposure. Your immune system is throwing everything it has at the problem, which is why you feel feverish and exhausted. The question is whether it can win fast enough, or if the infection will gain the upper hand and take you down. You lean against the wall under the ventilation shaft, looking up at that distant circle of sky, and for the first time since descending into this nightmare, you seriously contemplate giving up. You could try to climb out here, risk the ascent, possibly fall and break bones, but at least die trying to escape rather than succumbing to disease in the darkness. You could continue exploring, pushing yourself to find the river outfall, gambling that you can make it that far before collapse. Or you could just sit here, conserve energy, and hope that somehow the situation improves. None of these options are good. Medieval gong farmers faced these calculations every time they descended into the sewers. How much risk to accept, when to push forward versus when to retreat, how to balance the need to complete the job against the imperative to survive. Many got it wrong, pushing too hard or staying too long, and ended up as cautionary tales for the next generation. You're not going to make it a full day down here. That's clear now, undeniable even to your stubborn modern sensibility that insists you can overcome any challenge with enough determination. This isn't a challenge you can overcome. It's an environment specifically hostile to human survival, and you've already been compromised by it. The only question is how you get out before the damage becomes permanent. The fever is getting worse, and with it comes a clarity about just how many different ways this environment is killing you. You've been focused on the immediate visceral dangers: drowning, gas asphyxiation, getting lost. But the real threat has been working silently since the moment you stepped into contaminated water. Diseases, plural, because there's no way you've been exposed to just one pathogen. You're a walking petri dish at this point, hosting the beginning stages of multiple infections that medieval people died from by the thousands. Let's start with the most obvious: cholera. It's a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, and you've been wading through the most contaminated water imaginable for hours. The bacterium Vibrio cholerae thrives in exactly these conditions: warm, organic-rich, fecal-contaminated water. Medieval people called it the Blue Death because of how it discolored victims' skin as they died from catastrophic dehydration. The disease causes massive diarrhea and vomiting, your body expelling water faster than you can replace it, leading to death in as little as hours if untreated. The symptoms start innocuously enough: some stomach cramping, maybe some nausea. You're feeling both of those right now, though you've been attributing them to general stress and the foul air. But cholera moves fast once it establishes itself. Within hours, you'd progress to the watery diarrhea phase, losing liters of fluid. Your eyes would sink into your skull. Your skin would lose elasticity. Your blood would thicken until your heart couldn't pump it effectively. Medieval physicians had no treatment for this beyond prayer and herbal remedies that did nothing. Modern treatment involves aggressive rehydration with oral or 4 fluids, plus antibiotics, and even then, mortality rates can reach 50% without treatment. Then there's typhoid fever, another waterborne bacterial infection that was endemic in medieval cities. It's caused by Salmonella typhi, and it's more insidious than cholera because it takes longer to develop, a week or two from exposure to symptoms. That delayed onset meant medieval people often couldn't connect their illness to a specific exposure, so they blamed bad air or divine punishment or astrological alignments. The symptoms include high fever, which you're definitely developing, along with weakness, stomach pain, headache, and sometimes a rash. Untreated, it kills about 20% of victims, usually from intestinal perforation and peritonitis. Dysentery is almost certainly in your future too. It's a catch-all term for intestinal infections that cause bloody diarrhea, and it can be bacterial, Shigella, or parasitic, amoebic dysentery from Entamoeba histolytica. Medieval armies lost more soldiers to dysentery than to combat, because concentrated groups of men, poor sanitation, and contaminated water created perfect conditions for spread. The disease causes severe cramping, fever, and the passage of blood and mucus in stool. It's debilitating, painful, and in severe cases, fatal. What about parasites? Oh, you're definitely hosting parasites now, or at least you've ingested the eggs or cysts that will develop into them. Roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, hookworms, they were so common in medieval populations that having intestinal parasites was essentially normal. Some mummies from medieval times have been found with parasite loads so heavy it's amazing the people functioned at all. These parasites steal nutrients, damage intestinal walls, cause anemia, and in heavy infestations, can cause intestinal blockages or migrate to other organs. The medieval city sewers were also perfect incubators for leptospirosis, a bacterial infection transmitted through water contaminated with rat urine. You've seen the rats, hundreds of them, and they're urinating constantly into the same water you've been wading through. The bacteria enter your body through cuts in your skin, and you definitely have those from abrasions against rough stone and chemical burns from the tanning runoff. Leptospirosis causes flu-like symptoms initially, but can progress to kidney failure, liver failure, and bleeding in the lungs. Medieval physicians would have had no idea what was killing their patients, because the symptoms were so variable. And then there's the big one, the disease that defines the medieval period in popular imagination, the Black Death. Plague, caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, transmitted primarily by fleas that lived on rats. The same rats you've been encountering down here, the same rats that run through every sewer in every medieval city. Historians estimate that the plague killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, one of the most catastrophic mortality events in human history. Here's what makes plague particularly terrifying. It comes in three forms. Bubonic plague affects the lymph nodes, causing the characteristic buboes, swollen, painful lumps in the groin, armpits, or neck that sometimes rupture and leak pus. It has about a 60% mortality rate without treatment. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacteria multiply in the bloodstream, causing tissue death that turns fingers, toes, and noses black, hence Black Death. It's nearly always fatal without treatment. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs, spreads person to person through coughing, and kills almost 100% of untreated victims within days. The plague bacteria survive in rat populations, carried by fleas that jump between hosts. A medieval sewer is a plague reservoir, a place where the disease lurks between outbreaks, waiting for the right conditions to explode into human populations. The fleas are down here with you right now. You can't see them, but they're in the rat fur, in the fabric of your clothes, possibly already biting your skin and potentially transmitting bacteria with each bite. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was purely bubonic plague or if other diseases contributed to the death toll. Some scholars suggest that the rapid spread and high mortality indicates a pneumonic component, allowing person-to-person transmission rather than requiring flea bites. Others point to symptoms in historical accounts that don't quite match pure plague, suggesting perhaps multiple diseases circulating simultaneously. What's not in dispute is that medieval cities, with their sanitation conditions and dense rat populations, were plague factories. You touch your neck, feeling for swollen lymph nodes, and you're not sure if that tenderness you feel is real or psychosomatic. The fever is definitely real, though. You're alternating between chills that make your teeth chatter and waves of heat that leave you sweating despite the cool air. Your head throbs with each heartbeat. Your joints ache. These are the early stages of systemic infection, your body marshaling its defenses, and the outcome is far from certain. Medieval people understood that sewers and disease were connected, even if they had the mechanism wrong. The miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused illness, was actually a reasonable hypothesis given their observations. Diseases did seem to cluster around areas with bad smells, which happened to be areas with poor sanitation. They couldn't see the bacteria and parasites in the water, couldn't understand fecal-oral transmission routes, but they knew that proximity to waste made people sick. Some cities tried to improve sanitation. London passed ordinances requiring cesspits to be a certain distance from wells. Paris attempted to regulate where butchers could dump waste. Venice, with its unique challenges of being built on water, developed elaborate systems for managing waste and tried to keep its canals somewhat clean. But enforcement was always the problem. Individual property owners did what was cheapest and most convenient, and the collective result was urban environments saturated with pathogens. You drag yourself up, using the wall for support, because staying still lets the cold seep deeper into your bones and gives the fever more time to establish itself. Movement generates heat, keeps your circulation going, and might be the difference between surviving this experience and becoming one more body found by gong farmers weeks later. The light from the ventilation shaft has taken on a different quality. More orange, less white, suggesting the sun is lower in the sky. Late afternoon transitioning to evening, which means you've been down here perhaps 7 or 8 hours. 7 or 8 hours and you're already this compromised. The gong farmers did this for full shifts night after night, for years. The mortality rate of the profession makes more sense now. It wasn't just accidents, though those were common enough. It was the cumulative exposure, the constant bombardment of their immune systems with pathogens, the progressive damage to their organs from breathing toxic air and absorbing chemicals through their skin. They were dying slowly from the day they started the work, trading their health and lifespan for wages that reflected the horrific nature of the job. A typical gong farmer in medieval London might earn 2 shillings for cleaning out a cesspit, about twice what a skilled laborer would make in a day. For really horrible jobs, deep cesspits, ones that had been neglected for years, ones where people had died, the pay could be even higher. But what good is money if you're dead by 40? If you're too sick to enjoy anything? If polite society shuns you because you carry the smell of the sewers even after bathing? The social stigma was real and legally enforced in some places. Gong farmers were required to live in specific neighborhoods, often outside city walls. They could only work at night, partly for practical reasons. The smell was less offensive when people had their windows closed, but also to keep them out of sight during daylight hours. They were banned from many public spaces, couldn't touch food in markets, sometimes had to ring bells to warn others of their approach. Medieval society needed them desperately but wanted nothing to do with them personally. You push forward through the tunnel, following the sound of running water that seems to be growing louder. Your coordination is deteriorating. You stumble more frequently, misjudge distances, occasionally find yourself leaning against the wall for support without remembering how you got there. The fever is affecting your cognition, making time feel elastic and unreliable. Have you been walking for 5 minutes or 50? You can't tell. The tunnel opens suddenly into a larger space, and you nearly fall forward, expecting another step that isn't there. The sound of water is much louder here, almost deafening, and you can feel a breeze, actual moving air, the first you've experienced since descending. This must be near the outfall, the point where the sewer system dumps into a river. The light is better here too. Not direct sunlight, but the reflected glow from water visible ahead, suggesting an opening to the outside. You stumble toward that opening, desperate now, your body running on fumes and the last reserves of adrenaline. The floor is sloping downward, and the waste flow is faster, deeper, pulling at your legs with significant force. You're wading through thigh-deep sewage now, the current trying to sweep your feet out from under you, and you have to lean forward and push against it with every step. The opening is visible now, an arch of stone maybe 6 feet high, where the tunnel ends and opens onto a river. Beyond it, you can see actual sky, gray and overcast but infinitely beautiful compared to the stone ceiling you've been staring at for hours. The river is maybe 20 feet away, 20 feet of struggling through increasingly deep and fast-moving sewage, but it's the exit, it's freedom, it's your only chance. You're almost there when your foot catches on something submerged. A piece of debris, a gap in the floor you'll never know, and you lose your balance. The current catches you, and suddenly you're falling forward, your hands instinctively reaching out to break your fall, and you plunge face first into the sewage. The liquid closes over your head, and for one eternal moment of pure horror, you're fully submerged in medieval sewage. It's in your nose, your mouth, your ears, soaking into your hair, seeping into every pore. You taste it. God help you, you taste it. A flavor so indescribably vile that your body convulses, trying to vomit and cough and gag simultaneously. You thrash, fighting to get your head above the surface, your lungs screaming for air but not daring to inhale while submerged. You break the surface, gasping and choking, coughing up fluid, trying to clear your nose and mouth while the current continues to push you toward the opening. You're crying now, not from emotion but from physical reaction, your eyes streaming as they try to flush out the contamination. This is it, this is the exposure that seals your fate. Whatever diseases you might have avoided with careful navigation, you've now ingested directly. You've consumed medieval sewage. The current pushes you through the arch and out into the river proper, and you're immediately hit by actual sunlight, gray and weak through overcast sky but still shocking after the hours of darkness. The temperature change is jarring. The river water is cold, much colder than the sewage, fed by rainfall and upstream springs. You're swept several yards downstream before you manage to grab onto something. A wooden post, part of a dock or jetty, and pull yourself toward the bank. You collapse on the muddy riverbank, half in and half out of the water, too exhausted to move any further. Above you, the city rises, timber-framed buildings leaning at improbable angles, church spires pointing at the overcast sky, smoke rising from countless chimneys and workshops. You've made it out. You've survived the medieval sewer, though survived might be premature given the infections almost certainly establishing themselves in your system right now. But you're alive, breathing fresh air, well, fresh by medieval standards, which means smoke and animal waste but not concentrated sewage gas, and you can see the sky. You've lasted perhaps 8 hours in an environment that was never meant for human habitation, and even that limited exposure has left you fevered, exhausted, contaminated, and quite possibly dying from multiple diseases that won't show their full effects for days or weeks. The gong farmers who make their living in those tunnels, who descend night after night into that toxic darkness, who breathe those gases and wade through that waste for years, they're either the toughest humans who ever lived or the most desperate. Probably both. You lie on the riverbank, shivering uncontrollably, watching the gray sky fade toward dusk, and your fevered mind keeps returning to the same question. Who chooses this life? Who wakes up one morning and decides that cleaning cesspits and crawling through sewers is their career path? The answer, of course, is that almost nobody chooses it. They're forced into it by circumstances that leave no other options, and understanding those circumstances requires understanding just how brutal medieval economic realities could be. The gong farmers you might have encountered in those tunnels, Men like Richard the Raker, who died in his own cesspit in 1326, or the countless anonymous workers whose names appear in city records only when they're paid or when they die. These weren't people who had better alternatives. They were usually from the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. Landless peasants who'd migrated to cities seeking work, criminals given the choice between this job or worse punishment, debtors working off obligations, men who'd lost other employment due to injury or scandal. Gong farming was the job of last resort, the thing you did when every other door had closed. Here's how the profession actually worked in a city like medieval London. Property owners were responsible for maintaining their own cesspits, which needed cleaning every few years as they filled up. When the time came, they'd hire a gong farmer who would arrive at night, usually between 9 p.m. and dawn, because city ordinances banned the work during daylight hours due to the smell and social disruption. The gong farmer would bring his crew, typically 2 to 4 men, along with their tools: buckets, shovels with extended handles, hooks, and ropes. The process was straightforward but brutal. First, they'd remove the wooden cover from the cesspit, immediately releasing gases that had been building up for months or years. This was the most dangerous moment. The initial gas release could contain lethal concentrations of hydrogen sulfide and methane, and smart gong farmers would lower a candle on a rope to test the air before descending. If the candle flame went out or changed color, they'd know to wait for better ventilation or to stir the pit from above with long poles to release the gases gradually. Once the air was deemed survivable, and that's survivable, not safe, someone had to climb down into the cesspit. These pits varied enormously in size and design. A small household might have a pit 6 feet deep and 4 feet across. Wealthy estates or large institutions like monasteries might have chambers 15 feet deep and 10 feet across, holding years of accumulated waste. The worker would descend on a rope ladder or sometimes just a rope with knots, lowering himself into a confined space filled with compacted fecal matter that had the consistency of thick mud. At the bottom, working by the light of torches held by workers above, they couldn't bring fire down into the pit itself because of explosion risk. The gong farmer would fill buckets with waste. Each bucket held maybe 2 gallons and weighed 30 pounds or more when full. These buckets would be hauled up by rope, emptied into barrels, and sent back down. A typical cesspit cleaning might require removing dozens of barrels of waste, with each barrel representing multiple bucket trips. The work was physically exhausting, performed in a crouch or on your knees, breathing air that was barely adequate, soaked in sewage from constant splashing. The pay reflected the horror. Richard the Raker, for instance, was paid 2 shillings to clean a cesspit, about twice what a skilled craftsman made in a day. Really difficult jobs could pay even more, up to 4 or 5 shillings for the worst assignments. But this money came with serious costs beyond the obvious ones. Gong farmers were legally required to dispose of the waste they collected, which meant carting it outside city walls to designated dumping grounds or, if they were entrepreneurial, selling it to farmers as fertilizer. Human waste was actually a valuable commodity for agriculture. The nutrients in it enriched soil, but transporting barrels of sewage through city streets at night in carts that leaked and smelled abominable was hardly pleasant work. The mortality rate among gong farmers was staggering by even medieval standards. Parish records from London suggest that men who regularly worked in cesspits and sewers had life expectancies perhaps 15 to 20 years shorter than other laborers. The causes of death varied. Some, like Richard the Raker, drowned or suffocated in the pits when structures collapsed or gases overwhelmed them. Others died more slowly from respiratory diseases caused by years of breathing toxic air, from gastrointestinal diseases caused by constant exposure to pathogens, from liver and kidney damage from absorbed chemicals. There's a particularly grim record from 1326 Paris, coincidentally the same year Richard the Raker died in London, of a gong farmer named Jean who fell into a particularly deep cesspit and couldn't be retrieved before he asphyxiated. His body was left in the pit because removing it was deemed too dangerous and expensive, and the pit was simply sealed and a new one dug nearby. Jean's widow received no compensation because the death was classified as an accident resulting from his own work, not the property owner's negligence. His name survives in a court record only because his widow tried unsuccessfully to sue for death benefits. Historians still argue whether gong farming was technically a guild profession with apprenticeships and standards, or if it was too marginal for that kind of organization. Some records suggest that in larger cities like London and Paris, gong farmers did form loose associations for mutual support and to regulate prices. You didn't want too many competitors driving down the rates for such dangerous work. These groups would pass knowledge from experienced workers to newcomers. Which tools worked best, how to read the signs of dangerous gas buildup, techniques for breathing through cloth masks soaked in vinegar to reduce the worst of the air contamination, methods for moving efficiently in confined spaces. But calling it an apprenticeship makes it sound more formal than it was. More often, a desperate man would approach an established gong farmer and offer to work as an assistant for a share of the pay. If he survived a few jobs and learned the basics, he might start taking his own contracts. If he was smart, observant, and lucky, he might survive long enough to become one of the experienced workers training the next wave of desperate souls. Most didn't make it that far. The social stigma attached to the profession was intense and legally codified. In many medieval cities, gong farmers were required to live in specific areas, usually outside the city walls or in the least desirable neighborhoods near slaughterhouses and tanneries. They were banned from many public spaces, couldn't enter churches during services, though they could attend prayers before or after, weren't allowed to touch food in markets without making their profession known, and had to identify themselves to potential marriage partners. Some cities required them to wear distinctive clothing or badges so others could avoid them. This wasn't just snobbery, though there was plenty of that. It was also a recognition that these men carried disease. They were walking contamination vectors, their clothes saturated with sewage, their skin and hair never quite clean no matter how much they washed, their very presence associated with the smells and substances of waste. Medieval people couldn't understand germ theory, but they understood that proximity to gong farmers seemed to correlate with getting sick, and they responded with social exclusion that was often cruel but pragmatically understandable. The families of gong farmers lived with this stigma too. Children were bullied, wives were excluded from social gatherings, entire families found themselves isolated. This led to a certain amount of occupational clustering. Gong farmers' children often became gong farmers, not because it was a family tradition to be proud of, but because other professions were effectively closed to them. A form of social stratification developed where the absolute bottom of urban society became semi-hereditary, with families trapped in this profession for generations. Yet the work was absolutely essential. Without gong farmers, medieval cities would have drowned in their own waste within years. Cesspits would overflow, backing up into houses, flooding cellars, contaminating wells. The streets would become impassable. Disease rates, already high, would skyrocket. The entire urban system depended on these men being willing to do work that everyone else found unthinkable, and society's response was to pay them relatively well while simultaneously treating them as untouchables. There's something darkly fascinating about the economics of it. The work was so horrible that even desperately poor people would refuse it until they literally had no alternatives, which kept the supply of workers low, which kept the wages relatively high, which made the work attractive to people who had exhausted all other options. It was a sort of equilibrium reached through human desperation, just enough workers to keep the system functioning, just enough pay to attract those workers, just enough social stigma to ensure it remained a last resort. Some gong farmers tried to improve their situation through specialization. A man might become known for being particularly good at dealing with especially deep or problematic cesspits, commanding premium rates. Others might develop sidelines, selling the collected waste as fertilizer, recovering valuable items that had fallen into pits, jewelry, coins, tools, even occasionally being hired for discreet disposal of things that wealthy people wanted disappeared without questions asked. These specializations could improve income, but they didn't change the fundamental reality of the work or its effects on health and longevity. You're thinking about all this as you lie on the riverbank, shivering with fever, because understanding the profession helps you understand what you've just experienced. Those tunnels weren't designed for human habitation or even human passage. They were waste disposal infrastructure, and the fact that people worked in them regularly was a testament to desperate necessity overriding basic survival instinct. You went down there for 8 hours as an experiment, and it's almost certainly given you diseases that could kill you. They went down there shift after shift, year after year, knowing it was killing them slowly, because the alternative was starvation or homelessness or death from other causes. The medieval economic system created perverse incentives. A landless peasant arriving in a city had few options: begging, crime, or labor. The labor market was often saturated. There were more workers than jobs, which kept wages low for most professions. But gong farming always had openings because the turnover was so high. Men died. Men got too sick to continue. Men saved enough money to escape to other work. There was constant demand for new workers willing to descend into the darkness and the filth. Some cities tried to improve conditions. London's 1357 sanitation ordinances included provisions requiring property owners to maintain their cesspits properly, to ensure they were brick-lined rather than just holes in the ground, to keep them a certain distance from neighbors' wells. Enforcement was spotty, but at least there was recognition that better infrastructure would make the gong farmers' jobs somewhat less lethal. Paris had similar ordinances. Venice, with its unique challenges, actually hired permanent municipal workers to maintain its canal system, giving them something resembling job security and slightly better social status than freelance gong farmers elsewhere. But fundamentally, the work remained what it was: dangerous, disgusting, deadly, and essential. And the men who did it remained what they were: desperate, exploited, essential, and expendable. Medieval society recognized their necessity while simultaneously ensuring they remained separate, creating a cognitive dissonance that was never quite resolved. We need you, but we don't want to know you. You're essential, but you're also untouchable. Your work saves us, but you're damned for doing it. The sun has fully set now, and you need to move. Lying here on the riverbank invites hypothermia, invites thieves or worse. Medieval cities after dark were dangerous places, and won't help with the infections already establishing themselves in your system. You drag yourself upright, every muscle protesting, and start looking for some kind of shelter, some place to recover, though you know that recovery from this level of pathogen exposure without modern medicine is far from guaranteed. The gong farmers who survive their shifts will be starting work soon, descending into those same tunnels you just escaped, doing the job that society requires but refuses to honor. They'll breathe the same toxic air, wade through the same contaminated water, face the same risks of drowning, asphyxiation, or disease. And tomorrow night, they'll do it again. And the night after, until their bodies give out, until the inevitable accident happens, until the accumulated exposure finally overwhelms their systems. You've lasted 8 hours. They last years. The difference isn't courage. You're not more or less brave than they are. The difference is necessity. They have no choice, and that makes all the difference. You're stumbling through narrow medieval streets now, trying to put distance between yourself and the river, and you're starting to understand a truth that medieval people lived with constantly. The danger didn't end when you left the sewers. The entire city is fundamentally unstable, a death trap built on assumptions that collapse under scrutiny. And right now, weakened by fever, soaked in contamination, barely able to walk straight, you're vulnerable to all the hazards that medieval urban life can throw at you. The street is unpaved, just packed earth that's been turned to mud by recent rain and constant traffic. In the darkness, because it is fully dark now, the only light coming from occasional windows and the rare torch mounted outside a shop, You can't see the countless hazards underfoot. You step in something that squelches and releases a fresh wave of stench, probably animal waste from the horses and pigs that share these streets. Your boot catches on a discarded bone, and you stumble, barely catching yourself against a building's wall. That wall is damp, the timber frame rotting from moisture, and your hand comes away with splinters and something slimy. Medieval streets weren't really streets in the modern sense. They were spaces between buildings where people, animals, and waste all mixed together. There were no sidewalks, no drainage systems beyond the open gutters running down the center, no streetlights, no traffic rules. Buildings leaned out over the streets, each upper story jutting farther than the one below to maximize living space, until structures on opposite sides nearly touched overhead. This created dark canyons where sunlight barely reached even at noon, and at night, they became absolute black voids where anything could be lurking. The waste disposal system you experienced underground has its above-ground equivalent, and it's just as dangerous. Every household produces waste that has to go somewhere, and somewhere often means the street. Chamber pots get emptied out windows. The law says you're supposed to shout a warning first, usually, "Guard as low, watch for water," in French-influenced areas, but enforcement is impossible and people are lazy. So you're walking down the street in darkness, and suddenly there's a splash and a deluge of urine and feces falling from a window 3 stories up, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're soaked. You're already soaked in worse things, so maybe that particular hazard doesn't frighten you anymore. But there are others. Dead animals left to rot where they fell. Dogs, cats, rats, sometimes larger animals like horses or cows that died in the street and are too heavy to move easily. The law says property owners are responsible for removing them, but that takes time and effort, so they sit for days, bloating and decomposing, creating obstacles and adding to the general miasma. Then there are the industrial hazards. That building you're passing right now, it might be a butcher's shop, and they're dumping blood, entrails, and bone scraps out the back door directly into the street. Or it's a tanner's workshop, and those chemicals you encountered in the sewer runoff, they're being mixed in open vats just inside that door, and the fumes are drifting out into the street. Or it's a blacksmith's forge, and the heat is intense enough that standing nearby in winter is pleasant, but the smoke and particulates they're releasing are toxic if you breathe them long enough. Medieval cities had zoning ordinances trying to separate the most noxious industries from residential areas. Tanners, butchers, dyers, and other polluting trades were supposed to locate on the outskirts or downwind of the main city. But like all medieval regulations, enforcement was inconsistent and economic pressures often won out. A tanner who could afford property in a central location might move there despite ordinances, pay occasional fines as a cost of doing business, and continue operating. The result was that noxious industries were scattered throughout the city, creating pockets of intense pollution. You turn a corner and nearly collide with something large and warm that grunts indignantly. A pig, rooting through the garbage piled against a building. Medieval cities had chronic problems with free-roaming animals. Pigs were particularly troublesome because they were valuable. They turned garbage into meat, but also dangerous. A sow with piglets would attack if she felt threatened, and a full-grown pig could seriously injure or kill a person. London passed ordinances repeatedly trying to ban pigs from the streets, but they kept coming back because enforcement was impossible and people needed the free garbage disposal service they provided. The pig huffs at you and returns to its rooting, uninterested in a human who clearly poses no threat. You edge around it, and that's when you hear voices ahead. Men's voices, multiple speakers, with a particular tone that makes your modern sensibilities scream, danger. Medieval cities after dark were lawless in ways that modern urban dwellers struggle to comprehend. The night watch existed in theory, but they were usually poorly paid volunteers who didn't want to confront actual criminals. Street lighting was non-existent except for the occasional torch outside a wealthy person's house or a church. Anyone out after dark was either up to no good or a potential victim. You duck into a recessed doorway, pressing against the wood, trying to make yourself invisible. The voices grow louder, and 3 figures pass, visible only as darker shapes against the darkness, carrying something heavy between them. You catch a glimpse in the faint light from a window. It's a body, definitely human, limp and possibly dead. They're moving quickly, purposefully, and you don't want to know where they're going or what they're doing. Murder wasn't uncommon in medieval cities, and body disposal was a constant problem. The sewers, the river, abandoned buildings, they all received their share of inconvenient corpses. After they pass, you wait several more minutes before emerging, your heart pounding. The fever is making you paranoid, or maybe just appropriately cautious. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every sound could be someone approaching. Medieval streets were genuinely dangerous, and you're in no condition to defend yourself. You're weak, feverish, soaked in sewage, and obviously vulnerable. The perfect target for the desperate criminals who prowled after dark looking for anyone they could rob, assault, or worse. The buildings around you are mostly dark, but occasionally you see candlelight in windows, expensive beeswax candles for the wealthy, cheaper tallow candles for others, nothing at all for the poorest. Inside those buildings, families are dealing with their own waste management problems. They've got chamber pots under beds, and those pots will need emptying. Some houses have private cesspits in their cellars or courtyards. Those are the ones that hire gong farmers when they fill up. Others have arrangements to dump waste in communal cesspits or directly into the street gutters. The really wealthy, merchants, nobles, high-ranking clergy, might have garderobe chutes built into their walls, essentially vertical shafts where waste drops from upper-floor latrines down to a cesspit at ground level or even directly into a sewer channel if they're fortunate enough to have one nearby. These garderobes were a status symbol of sorts, a sign that you could afford proper waste disposal infrastructure. But they created their own problems. The chutes would cake up with dried waste, requiring someone to climb inside periodically and scrape them clean, a job that was somehow even worse than regular gong farming. You're looking for somewhere safe to rest, but safety is relative in a medieval city at night. Churches might offer sanctuary, but you'd have to get inside first, and many locked their doors after evening prayers. Inns exist, but they require money and wouldn't welcome someone in your condition. You're literally covered in sewage, you smell like death, and you're obviously sick. Hospitals exist too, but medieval hospitals were primarily religious institutions focused on spiritual care as much as physical treatment, and they had limited space for the truly desperate cases. There's a sudden sound of rushing water, and you realize you're near another sewer outfall. A smaller one than where you emerged, just a stone arch at street level where a drainage channel opens onto the riverbank. Water and waste are gushing out with significant force, the result of someone upstream dumping a large quantity of liquid. This is a flash flood in miniature, the same phenomenon that nearly killed you in the tunnels, and it's powerful enough that if anyone were in that channel right now, they'd be swept out into the river and possibly drowned. The flash flooding was a constant hazard in medieval sewer systems, and it killed workers regularly. There was no way to predict when someone would dump their brewery's wastewater or their dye shop's used chemicals or the accumulated contents of a cesspit. It just happened without warning, and anyone downstream had to either find high ground fast or get swept away. The gong farmers developed an instinct for it. They could hear the rumble, feel the change in air pressure, sense the water flow reversing, but even that wasn't always enough to save them. You keep moving, following the riverbank because at least it's a landmark you can orient yourself by. The river itself is as polluted as the sewers. It receives all the outfall from the city's drainage system, plus direct dumping from riverside industries, plus the waste from ships anchored in the current. But it's moving water, which means it carries the contamination downstream and out to sea, which means the city doesn't accumulate waste quite as badly as it otherwise would. Cities built on rivers had a sewage solution that was crude but functional. Let the river handle it, and if that meant cities downstream received contaminated water, well, that was their problem. London had the Thames, Paris had the Seine, Rome had the Tiber, and they all served the same dual function: water source and waste disposal. People drew drinking water from the same river they dumped sewage into, usually trying to draw from upstream of the main sewer outfalls, but not always successfully. The medieval understanding of water safety was limited to observations like water from wells is usually better than river water, and clear water is better than murky water. But they had no way to detect invisible contamination. Some cities had better water management than others. Venice, for all its problems, had a system of cisterns that collected rainwater and filtered it through sand, providing relatively clean water without depending on polluted canals. Some monasteries had piped water systems that drew from springs miles away, ensuring clean supply. But for most urban dwellers, water safety was a gamble. You drank what was available and hoped it wouldn't kill you. And if it did make you sick, you blamed bad air or divine punishment or astrological influences rather than invisible bacteria. You're desperately thirsty now, your mouth dry as leather, your throat raw from breathing sewer gases and from coughing up the sewage you accidentally inhaled. The river is right there, flowing past, and part of your fevered brain is suggesting you could just drink from it. It's moving water, it's being diluted, maybe it's safe enough. But even in your compromised state, you know that's insane. You've seen what goes into that river. You've been in what goes into that river. Drinking it would be suicide, adding even more pathogens to the already overwhelming load your immune system is fighting. Historians still argue whether medieval people's shorter lifespans were primarily due to high infant mortality skewing the averages, or if adults also died younger than they would have with better living conditions. The evidence suggests both factors mattered. Infant and childhood mortality was catastrophic. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5, from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or violence. But adults also died younger, with life expectancies in the 40s or 50s for those who survived childhood, compared to 70s or 80s today. The causes of adult death were multifaceted, but infectious disease was the biggest killer. The unsanitary conditions, contaminated water, inadequate waste disposal, crowded housing, poor nutrition, created an environment where pathogens thrived. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and plague killed tens of thousands in epidemic years. Even in non-epidemic years, disease was endemic, constantly circulating, claiming lives steadily if not spectacularly. And occupational exposure, like what Gong farmers experienced, accelerated the process dramatically. You spot a fountain ahead, not a decorative fountain, but a public water source, stone basin collecting water from a pipe. These were common in medieval cities, fed by aqueducts or underground pipes from wells or springs. The water quality varied enormously depending on the source and the maintenance of the pipes. Lead pipes leached toxic lead into the water. Cracked pipes allowed contamination to seep in from surrounding soil. But it's water and you're desperate. You approach the fountain and cup your hands, catching some of the flow. It's cold, which is promising, probably from a relatively deep well or distant spring. It's clear, not obviously contaminated with particles or color. But intellectually, that clarity means nothing. The bacteria that cause cholera and typhoid are invisible. The parasites might be present as microscopic cysts. This water could be perfectly safe or it could be a death sentence, and you have no way to know. You drink anyway because thirst is immediate and death is theoretical. The water tastes mineral heavy, slightly metallic, probably iron in the aquifer, or maybe lead from the pipes. But it soothes your raw throat and provides the hydration your body desperately needs. You drink deeply, ignoring the voice in your head screaming about waterborne diseases, because at this point, what's a few more pathogens added to the collection you're already hosting? After drinking, you slump against the fountain's stone base, too exhausted to go farther. The fever has you in its grip now, alternating between chills that make your teeth chatter and sweats that soak your already damp clothing. Your head is pounding, your joints ache, and you're starting to experience the gastrointestinal symptoms you've been dreading. Cramping, nausea, the urgent pressure that suggests dysentery is beginning to establish itself. This is what medieval people experienced constantly. Not everyone, not all the time, but enough people, often enough that disease was simply part of life's background. You expected to get sick periodically. You expected to lose children to illness. You expected epidemics to sweep through every few years and claim neighbors, friends, family members. The question wasn't whether you'd encounter disease, it was whether you'd survive it, and that depended on factors mostly beyond your control. Your constitution, your nutrition status, your luck. You've been in medieval conditions for less than a day, and you're already sick and getting sicker. The gong farmers who survive years in this environment are statistical miracles, genetic lottery winners with immune systems tough enough to withstand constant assault. And even they die young, worn down by the relentless exposure, their bodies giving out decades before they should. You close your eyes, just for a moment, just to rest, and the world spins dizzyingly behind your eyelids. You wake, if you can call it waking, when the line between consciousness and fever dreams has become so blurred, to pre-dawn light filtering through the narrow gap between buildings. You're still slumped against the fountain, and your body has stiffened into a twisted posture that sends shooting pains through your back and legs when you try to move. The fever has progressed through the night, and you can feel that you're worse now, significantly worse, your body losing the battle against the infections that have had hours to establish themselves in your system. Let's be brutally honest about what's happening inside you right now. The bacteria you ingested when you fell face first into the sewage have found their way into your intestinal tract, where they're multiplying exponentially. Vibrio cholerae, if you pick that up, is producing toxins that cause your intestinal cells to dump water and electrolytes into your gut, setting up the catastrophic diarrhea that defines cholera. Salmonella typhi is invading your intestinal wall, entering your bloodstream, and beginning to multiply in your organs. That's why your fever is spiking, your body trying desperately to kill the invaders with heat. The parasites, and you almost certainly have multiple species now, are in various stages of their life cycles. Roundworm eggs have hatched in your intestines, and the larvae are beginning their migration through your body. Some will make it to your lungs, where they'll be coughed up and swallowed again to complete their cycle. Others might get lost and end up in inappropriate organs, causing inflammation and tissue damage. Giardia cysts, if present, have released their active forms and are attaching to your intestinal walls, interfering with nutrient absorption and causing the bloating and gas that's making your abdomen feel distended and painful. Your immune system is mounting a massive response, flooding your body with inflammatory cytokines, raising your temperature to try to create an environment hostile to the pathogens, redirecting resources away from non-essential functions to focus on fighting the invasion. This is why you feel so terrible. The fever, aches, fatigue, and malaise aren't really caused by the pathogens themselves, but by your own immune system's aggressive defense. It's necessary for survival, but it makes you feel like you're dying, and in some cases, the immune response itself can be lethal if it becomes too extreme. Modern you, with your 21st century immune system, is at a severe disadvantage compared to medieval people who survived to adulthood. They'd been exposed to these pathogens repeatedly throughout their lives, starting in childhood. Their immune systems had learned to recognize and fight these specific threats. Many had survived previous bouts of dysentery, had hosted intestinal parasites since childhood, had encountered the bacteria that cause food poisoning and water contamination dozens of times. They had acquired immunity, not complete, not perfect, but better than nothing. You have none of that. Your immune system is encountering most of these pathogens for the first time. It's learning on the fly, trying to generate appropriate antibodies, attempting to kill invaders it's never seen before. Some responses will be effective. Humans have innate immunity to certain threats that doesn't require prior exposure. But other responses will be inadequate or even counterproductive, and while your system figures out the right approach, the pathogens are multiplying and causing damage. The statistics on disease survival in medieval times are sobering. Cholera killed about 50% of untreated victims, better odds than you might think, but still a coin flip. Typhoid killed about 20% without treatment, though it could take weeks to kill you or to clear the infection. Dysentery mortality varied wildly depending on the specific pathogen and the victim's overall health, maybe 10 to 25% for otherwise healthy adults, much higher for children or the already weakened. Parasitic infections rarely killed directly but contributed to malnutrition and weakened resistance to other diseases. Add up all the various threats you're hosting, and your survival probability drops significantly. It's not just about fighting one infection. It's about fighting multiple infections simultaneously while malnourished, dehydrated, exhausted, and without any medical treatment beyond medieval folk remedies that range from useless to actively harmful. The compounding effect of multiple stressors is what kills you, not any single pathogen in isolation. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine did more harm than good, or if some treatments actually helped despite being based on incorrect theory. Bloodletting, for instance, the practice of deliberately removing blood from a patient, seems obviously harmful today. You're sick, your body needs resources to fight infection, and they're taking away blood that carries oxygen and immune cells. But some scholars point out that mild bloodletting might reduce fever slightly and might have a placebo effect that improved outcomes through psychological mechanisms. Others argue it was purely harmful and probably killed patients who might have otherwise survived. Herbal remedies were more promising. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, and actually does reduce fever and pain. Garlic has mild antimicrobial properties. Various herbs used for digestive complaints might have helped soothe inflamed tissues even if they didn't kill pathogens. But medieval physicians had no way to test their treatments systematically, no concept of controlled experiments or statistical analysis. They relied on tradition, authority, and anecdotal experience, which meant effective remedies were mixed randomly with useless or harmful ones, and there was no way to distinguish between them. You need help, actual medical help, but that's not available in medieval terms that would actually work. A medieval physician, if you could afford one, which most people couldn't, would examine your symptoms and likely diagnose an imbalance of humors. You're feverish and have diarrhea, so you're clearly suffering from excess heat and moisture, which means you need cooling and drying treatments. They might prescribe bloodletting to remove the excess hot, moist blood. They might recommend specific foods to rebalance your humors, perhaps cold, dry foods like certain grains and vegetables while avoiding hot, moist foods like meat and wine. None of this would address the actual problem, the bacteria multiplying in your gut, the parasites establishing themselves in your tissues, the dehydration from fluid loss, the electrolyte imbalances that will eventually stop your heart if uncorrected. Medieval medicine had no concept of pathogens, no understanding of the germ theory of disease that wouldn't be developed until the late 19th century. They knew disease existed, knew it could spread from person to person, knew certain conditions made it more likely. But the mechanism, invisible microorganisms invading your body, was completely beyond their conceptual framework. The irony is that some medieval treatments accidentally worked despite the wrong reasoning. Quarantine during plague outbreaks actually helped by limiting disease transmission, even though they thought they were avoiding miasma rather than bacteria-carrying fleas. Boiling water for tea or beer killed pathogens, even though they just thought they were preparing beverages. Certain herbal preparations had genuine medicinal effects, even though the theory behind their use was incorrect. But for your current situation, multiple severe infections requiring immediate intervention, medieval medicine offers nothing that would save you. You need antibiotics to kill the bacteria, antiparasitic drugs to eliminate the worms and protozoa, for fluids to correct dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, possibly hospitalization with intensive care if the infections have caused organ damage. None of that exists in the medieval world. Your survival would depend entirely on your immune system winning the fight on its own, and the odds are not good. You manage to stand, using the fountain for support, and you realize that your time in medieval conditions needs to end now. Not just because you're sick, though you're definitely very sick, but because continuing this experiment serves no purpose. You've learned what you needed to learn. That medieval sewer systems were death traps, that the people who worked in them were extraordinarily tough or extraordinarily desperate or both, that the entire medieval urban environment was saturated with health hazards that modern people simply can't comprehend without direct experience. You lasted maybe 10 hours total in and around the medieval sewers, 8 hours underground, 2 more hours in the streets above, and that limited exposure has infected you with potentially lethal diseases, exhausted you physically and mentally, and taught you a profound respect for the people who lived entire lives in these conditions. The gong farmers who descended into the tunnels night after night, the families who lived in houses where waste disposal meant throwing it out the window, the children who played in streets contaminated with every pathogen imaginable. They weren't tougher than modern people, they were just living in a different reality where these hazards were unavoidable. The question isn't really, why wouldn't you last a day in medieval sewers? The better question is, how did anyone survive in medieval cities at all? And the answer is many didn't. The mortality rates were horrific by modern standards. Children died in staggering numbers, 30 to 40% before age 5 in urban environments. Adults died from diseases that are trivial inconveniences today. Epidemics swept through cities every few years and killed thousands. The population of medieval cities was only sustained by constant immigration from the countryside, because urban death rates exceeded birth rates. Medieval people knew their cities were unhealthy. There are records of physicians and city officials recognizing that urban life was more dangerous than rural life, that the air was bad, that the water was contaminated, that disease spread more easily in crowded conditions. Some wealthy people maintained country estates specifically so they could flee the city during plague season or the hot summer months when disease risk peaked. But for most people, there was no escape. You lived in the city because that's where the work was, where the opportunities were, and you accepted the health risks as part of the bargain. The gong farmers, in particular, knew exactly what they were trading. They took a job that would probably kill them within 10 or 20 years in exchange for wages that were higher than most other manual labor. It was a calculated risk, or perhaps more accurately, a forced choice when all other options were worse. They developed techniques to minimize immediate danger, testing air quality before descending, working in teams so someone could pull you out if you collapsed, learning to recognize the signs of imminent tunnel collapse. But they couldn't protect themselves from the cumulative exposure to pathogens and toxins. The medieval sewer system, viewed from a modern perspective, is a perfect example of infrastructure that technically functions but at a cost that we consider completely unacceptable today. It did remove waste from households and streets. It did prevent cities from being buried in their own refuse. It did allow urban populations to grow beyond what would otherwise be possible. But it killed the workers who maintained it, it spread disease throughout the population, it polluted water sources, and it created living conditions that were genuinely dystopian. You're stumbling through the awakening city now, trying to find your way to somewhere safe, somewhere with clean water and rest and possibly medical care that might actually help. The streets are beginning to fill with people. Merchants opening shops, workers heading to their jobs, children being sent on errands, animals being driven to market. Life in the medieval city continues, as it has for centuries, with everyone navigating the hazards as best they can and hoping that today won't be the day that the invisible threats finally overwhelm them. A woman passes you carrying 2 buckets on a yoke across her shoulders. She's a water carrier, someone who makes their living hauling water from wells or fountains to households that will pay for the service. Her buckets are wooden, probably not very clean, and the water sloshing in them might or might not be safe to drink. But she's providing an essential service, because carrying water is labor-intensive and time-consuming. and people who can afford it will pay someone else to do it. A man drives a cart past, heading toward the city gates. He's probably a night soil collector or a gong farmer who's finished a night's work and is hauling his barrels of waste out to the dumping grounds beyond the walls. His cart leaves a trail of stench and occasionally drips, adding to the street contamination. People avoid him, stepping aside to let him pass, holding cloths over their faces against the smell. He ignores them, focused on his task, probably eager to finish this run so he can go home and collapse into exhausted sleep. This is the reality of medieval waste management. It works, after a fashion, but it's labor-intensive, dangerous, and thoroughly unpleasant for everyone involved. The workers are stigmatized and short-lived. The streets are perpetually contaminated. The air quality is poor, and disease is endemic. But it's the best solution available given the technology, knowledge, and resources of the time. Cities can't exist without waste management, and this is what waste management looked like for centuries. Your modern perspective gives you the luxury of being horrified by all this, of recognizing how dangerous and unhealthy it is, of understanding the germ theory behind why these conditions spread disease. But that perspective doesn't give you any advantage in surviving the immediate threats. You're still sick with multiple infections, still exhausted and dehydrated, still potentially dying from exposure to pathogens your immune system can't handle. Knowledge doesn't replace antibiotics or clean water or medical care. The sun is fully up now, and you can see the city in daylight for the first time. It's simultaneously more impressive and more horrifying than you expected. The buildings are architecturally interesting, timber frames creating patterns, upper stories jutting out at angles, occasional stone structures of churches or wealthy merchants' houses providing solid anchors among the wood. But the streets are filthy, waste everywhere, the smell omnipresent, and the people show signs of the hard life they're living. Missing teeth, skin conditions, limps and deformities from inadequately healed injuries, the general wear of a population without modern health care. You find yourself wondering how gong farmers felt at the end of their shifts, emerging from the tunnels into dawn light after a night in the darkness and filth. Did they feel relief at having survived another shift? Pride at having completed necessary work? Resignation at knowing they'd have to do it again tomorrow? All of the above, probably mixed with the physical exhaustion and the knowledge that every shift was shortening their lifespan by some imperceptible amount. There's a certain existential weight to doing work that you know is killing you. Modern workers in dangerous professions, coal miners, asbestos workers before regulations, soldiers in wartime, face similar psychological burdens. But at least modern workers usually have some concept of the specific risks, some safety equipment however inadequate, some legal framework that acknowledges their sacrifice. Medieval gong farmers had none of that, just the knowledge that the work needed doing, that someone had to do it, and that today they were still alive even if tomorrow was uncertain. Your legs finally give out, and you collapse against a building wall, sliding down to sit on the filthy cobblestones. You're done, finished, unable to continue. The fever has you shaking uncontrollably. The gastrointestinal symptoms are becoming urgent and impossible to ignore, and your consciousness is starting to fade at the edges. This is what dying of disease feels like. Not dramatic or quick, but a slow shutdown as your body systems are overwhelmed by invaders they can't defeat. But you're not actually in the medieval period, not really. This has been an exploration, a thought experiment, an immersive dive into what life was like in conditions that most modern people can barely imagine. The reality is that you wouldn't last a day in medieval sewers, not really, not if your survival depended on functioning in that environment with medieval resources and medieval medical care. You'd get sick, probably severely sick, and your outcome would depend on factors beyond your control, which pathogens you encountered, how strong your immune system was, whether you got lucky or unlucky in the genetic lottery that determines disease resistance. The people who lived in medieval cities, who worked in the sewers, who survived the diseases and dangers and went on to raise families and live lives. They weren't superhuman. They were just humans adapting to the conditions they were born into, developing immunities through harsh childhood exposure, learning survival skills that we've forgotten, accepting mortality rates that we'd find intolerable. They were tougher than us in some ways, more vulnerable in others, and above all, they were making the best of circumstances that were genuinely terrible by modern standards. So why wouldn't you last a day in medieval city sewers? Because your immune system is unprepared, your body is adapted to clean water and clean air, your mind expects safety measures that don't exist, and your survival skills are completely inappropriate to the environment. You're a time traveler without adaptation, a modern person dropped into historical horror, and the gap between your expectations and reality is wide enough to kill you. The gong farmers who lasted years in that environment have earned a respect that history has largely denied them. They were essential workers doing impossible jobs under nightmare conditions, and they deserve to be remembered not as outcasts or untouchables, but as people who kept civilization functioning at tremendous personal cost. Their short lives and painful deaths were the price medieval cities paid for growth and complexity, and understanding their sacrifice helps us appreciate the infrastructure and public health systems we take for granted today. As the morning light strengthens and the city fully awakens around you, you understand finally and completely, medieval sewers weren't designed for human survival. They were designed for waste disposal, and the fact that humans could work in them at all was a testament to human resilience and desperation. You've glimpsed that reality, felt its dangers, and learned the most important lesson. Sometimes the greatest achievement isn't conquering a challenge. It's recognizing when a challenge is fundamentally unconquerable and having the wisdom to acknowledge that truth. The medieval city continues its daily rhythm, indifferent to your presence. It's people navigating hazards they've known their entire lives. And you, the modern visitor to their world, can only marvel at their resilience while acknowledging your own limitations. You wouldn't last a day in medieval sewers because you were never meant to. No one was. Let yourself drift now, away from those dark tunnels and toxic waters, back to your own time where clean water flows from taps with a simple turn, where sewage disappears with a flush, where diseases have names and treatments, where the night holds no terror because light is always just a switch away. You're safe here, in your comfortable bed, breathing clean air, protected by centuries of engineering and medical advancement that medieval people couldn't even imagine. Think of those gong farmers one last time, not with horror but with quiet respect. Those desperate souls who descended into darkness so their cities could function, who traded their health for wages, who died young so others could live in relative comfort. They're long gone now, their names mostly forgotten, their stories reduced to occasional mentions in historical records, but their sacrifice was real and their work was essential. They kept civilization running in ways that were invisible to everyone who benefited from it. The sewer tunnels still exist in some medieval cities, buried beneath modern streets, forgotten by most but still there, still carrying water, still serving their function centuries later. The stones they laid, the channels they dug, the systems they maintained. All of it endures as silent testimony to work that was never glamorous but was always necessary. And somewhere in those dark spaces, if you listen carefully, you might imagine you hear the echo of footsteps, the splash of water, the distant voices of workers who knew their labor was killing them but descended anyway because someone had to, because the work needed doing, because that's what survival sometimes requires. Rest now. Let those images fade. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be the comfortable darkness of sleep, not the absolute blackness of underground tunnels. Let your breathing slow and deepen, each breath drawing in clean air, each exhalation releasing tension and worry. You're here, you're safe, you're alive in a time when survival doesn't require daily battles with invisible enemies, when infrastructure works silently and efficiently to protect you from dangers you'll never see. Sleep well, knowing that the horrors you've imagined tonight are safely contained in the past. that the men who lived them are at rest now. Their struggles over, their pain ended. And tomorrow, when you wake, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern sanitation. Not for its technology alone, but for the fact that no one has to die to maintain it, that the work of keeping cities clean and safe doesn't require human sacrifice anymore. That's progress worth celebrating, bought with the lives of countless unnamed workers across centuries. Their legacy is your comfort. Their sacrifice is your safety. Remember them, honor them, and rest easy in the world they helped build.